Welcome to Christian Identity, From Weaponized Religion to the NAR, Part 1. Some of you may already be familiar with the video, which was released in segments as NAR the Series, and the transcript for this series was produced for the book, which will be released on Amazon on September 1st. You'll find a link to the book in the description of the video. And stay tuned after the presentation for more details about the research, the creation of the video, the book, and more.
In the late 20th century, the Church witnessed what appeared to be a peculiar and novel phenomenon. Christians started forsaking traditional houses of worship in favor of gathering in vast auditoriums. The once simple gospel lost its allure. Inspirational sermons were discarded, making way for elements reminiscent of the entertainment industry. The music grew louder and more dramatic, with memorable phrases echoing in the minds of congregations long after the services concluded. No longer were sermons solely centered around Jesus or even Christianity. Ministers began to infuse politics into their core doctrines. They skillfully blended elements of populism and anti-establishmentism. These ministers sowed seeds of fear, suggesting that elected government officials were opposing their ministries. According to their narrative, if these officials succeeded, Satan himself would ascend to power. They diligently watered these seeds with current events and international conflicts, asserting that news agencies had verified these apprehensions. Congregants were systematically indoctrinated and manipulated into believing that an imminent threat loomed. By skillfully weaving together eschatology, nationalism, politics, and news of global conflict, ministers successfully convinced unsuspecting followers that their apocalyptic scenarios were unfolding. The world, as they knew it, was about to collapse. Satan and his legion of religious and political demons had infiltrated not only the church, but also the education system and government offices. Many subtle ideologies were introduced in the form of doctrine, each sounding somewhat biblical yet esoteric. Individually, and in their infancy, the doctrines were benign. However, as they became adopted as new canon, these ideologies became increasingly more destructive. Themes of aggression and elitism began to emerge. Sermons no longer encouraged listeners to show kindness to their neighbors. Congregants became polarized against those who did not agree with their pseudo-Christian, openly political, extra-biblical, and esoteric ideas. The nasty cocktail of bad theology painted the picture of a world where the forces of good and evil were constantly at war, then blurred the lines separating the two. New leaders began to emerge, claiming to have prophetic insight into the spirit world. People with itching ears abandoned critical thought in the hype of prophecy, while prophets learned the power of persuasion their supposed visions had over the hearts and minds of their listeners. New ideas were eagerly accepted simply by having the label of prophecy. Children were raised to believe and accept these predictions and ideologies as gospel truth. Worse, they were trained to associate them with key passages from the Bible, altering their perception of Christianity. As adults, they viewed others who accepted their blend of doctrine and scripture as being Christian, while they viewed anyone opposed as an apostate. Many of those adults became elders, preachers, evangelists, and prophets. Having been trained to associate the supposed apostate churches with demonic forces, some of them began to preach against fellow Christians with opposing views. With the proverbial line drawn in the sand, they had effectively severed themselves from the Christian church. A new breed of Christianity emerged, one that bore little resemblance to its ancestry. During its early formation, it hardly resembled a unified movement. Several disconnected, and even opposing groups of Christians were simultaneously influenced by evangelists and prophets during revivals and conventions under the guise of open door or interdenominational fellowship. Bad theology was injected into unsuspecting groups of Christians who had otherwise adopted sound teaching. Extra-biblical doctrines associated with recurring social political themes continued to develop. They spread like a virus, especially among groups that had replaced the gospel with more entertaining forms of worship and teaching. As a result, identifying the churches or groups infected with the destructive theologies became increasingly difficult. Unless a particular group progressed into extremism, they were viewed only as eccentric or overzealous. Groups that adopted only a handful of the extra-biblical doctrines, though viewed as unorthodox and unusual, remained relatively harmless. However, those who favored the extra-biblical over the core precepts of Scripture continued to become more dangerous and, in certain cases, deadly. It wasn't until a group began to edge closer towards a climactic event that they were recognized as destructive. Due to the disconnected and unstructured nature of the movement as it formed, Christian historians struggled to understand the connection between groups that had become isolationists or displayed unhealthy characteristics. Even after a particular group developed into a destructive cult and came to a tragic end, sparking legal, criminal, and historical investigations, the connections to the ideological framework were often overlooked. Since some core doctrines had shifted after the central figures of the destructive groups severed themselves from their respective denominations of faith, it was mistakenly assumed that the destructive qualities came after the separation. The underlying architecture of bad theology that enabled the destructive central figures was overlooked. It wasn't until years later that examiners of the movement began to notice patterns and similarities between individual groups. Many leaders of the movement were very charismatic, though only some had emerged directly from the charismatic movement. Others were either Pentecostal or had been strongly influenced by modern Pentecostalism. Some of the groups proudly described their historical lineage to men and women that they considered to be God's generals, whom they claimed to be heroes of the faith. Others, aware that some of the people classified as generals were unsavory characters, unethical and even criminal, tried to conceal their lineage from congregants and especially from outsiders. Beliefs that outsiders were subservient were common among groups within the movement, and over time, that belief was openly stated under the title of dominionism. Elements of the political ideologies that had fused with Christianity became very evident within the movement when leaders began proclaiming the Seven Mountain Mandate. Members were instructed to use any means possible to influence family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government, just as their political ancestors had attempted through various political schemes. The political agenda of the movement became even more transparent when key leaders within the group openly declared their allegiance and support of their political candidates, and those candidates leveraged the support of those same religious leaders to secure votes. Eventually, the movement was given the title New Apostolic Reformation, a term coined by one of the early influencers of the group, C. Peter Wagner. Wagner, his supportive contemporaries, and countless others in the lineage of the movement taught members to believe that a reformation was possible through spiritual warfare. Some early proponents of the movement mistakenly assumed that spiritual warfare simply meant engaging in prayer for a positive outcome. However, as the movement continued to polarize its views of outsiders, the meaning of the word warfare became more and more obscure. Converts to the New Apostolic Reformation included a wide variety of groups, some of which leaned heavily towards extremism. From Christian identity and Christian nationalist groups to health and prosperity gospel televangelists and their cult followers, the NAR suddenly emerged as a network of vastly different people. Yet when compared to traditional Christianity, all of them could be considered extremist. Eventually, the NAR network was branded the Christian Taliban. While the term New Apostolic Reformation is relatively new, the weaponization of religion for political purposes to oppress groups of people deemed subordinate to another is as old as history has been recorded. In the ancient world, the union of politics and religion was deeply embedded into the identity of entire kingdoms of people. It would not seem unusual for a network of religious extremists to break down the walls separating church and state. In fact, to the non-Christian ancients, it would seem normal and heroic. However, the NAR, as it developed in the modern world, was far from what ancient Christians would consider to be heroic or even as Christian. Leaders of the Dominion theology began to expound on their doctrine, including predictions of violence. Some groups went as far as predicting a coming purge enacted by NAR converts. Of all the parents and grandparents of the NAR, Christian identity is by far the most interesting. While most members of the NAR unknowingly combine their blend of politics and religion to form their identity, the early adherents of the Christian identity movement openly identified with that same union. Without the Christian identity component, the NAR could never have developed in such a way that members could be compared to the Taliban, an Islamic nationalist group linked to terrorism. One could go so far as to say that to understand the NAR and how it developed, one must first understand the history of Christian identity. And while the history of identity itself is somewhat exclusive to the racial and cultural issues of the United States, its predecessor, British Israelism, was not. For a look inside the mindset of an elitist group such as the NAR, that, while claiming to be Christian, viewed other Christians as subordinate or inferior, one must go back in time to Scotland, when Robert the Bruce fought to restore Scotland to an independent kingdom. To understand the profound link between the new Apostolic Reformation, or NAR movement, and Christian identity, one must first recognize the movement's strong ties to the nation of Israel. Predecessors were, and are still, obsessed with apocalyptic predictions. As proponents of Christian Zionism, they closely associate these predictions with events in Israel's historical timeline, past, present, and future. This connection becomes deeply troubling when we consider some of these predictions in light of the racial and anti-Semitic components associated with Christian identity. For example, NAR leader Mike Bickle predicted that a second Jewish Holocaust would unfold just before the end of days. Bickle, a prominent Christian Zionist within the movement, echoed voices of Christian identity extremists when he declared, quote, "The tribulation is not something that happens to us, the tribulation is something that happens through us." Though his statement was certainly not intended with the same tones of anti-Semitism of the more violent leaders of Christian identity, as we continue to examine the source of the doctrine, it most certainly developed from the same foundation. John Hagee, a prominent ally of NAR leaders, founded Christians United for Israel, CUFI, and hosts annual CUFI Washington summits. He is known for adding a racial component to his Christian Zionist beliefs. According to Hagee, Jews are not included in the gospel of Jesus Christ and are saved by their race, rather than through grace. This notion is referred to as a dual covenant, which closely resembles the two-seed or dual seed doctrine associated with Christian identity and white supremacy. While Hagee claims that this doctrine supports Jews, denying them access to the gospel is truly anti-Semitic and goes against the teachings of the biblical Apostle Paul in Romans 1 verse 16. Though it has evolved over time, these unusual beliefs emerged as a result of the latter rain movement of 1948, which many leaders of the NAR refer to as a movement inspired by God. That movement came to be known as latter rain, due to the formation of the nation of Israel in May 1948. Adherents believed that Israel and the latter rain movement was the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy of Joel. Many leaders of the movement had strong ties to British Israelism, and key figures in latter rain were affiliated with Christian identity organizations, such as the Anglo-Saxon Federation. The leader of the revival that sparked the latter rain movement, William Branham, held strong ties to key figures in both British Israelism and Christian identity. Branham was one of the strongest supporters of Christian identity's dual seed theology, which he branded as the serpent seed and predicted a coming war between races. Hagee appears to have simply repeated Branham's anti-Semitic doctrines, excluding the Jewish race from the gospel of Jesus Christ. How did this belief in Christianity's ties to Israel begin? Why did ministers come to believe that ancient biblical prophecy could be repurposed from their original context? to the 20th and 21st centuries? To answer this question, we must first examine a series of events that happened between officials in Scotland and the Catholic Church during the early 1300s. During the First War of Scottish Independence in 1317, only about 30 years after the ending of the Crusades, Pope John XXII imposed a truce between England and Scotland. Neither Scotland nor England fully accepted the pontiff's demand, though threats of religious persecution by the Catholic Church temporarily brought restraint. King Robert I of Scotland, otherwise known as Robert the Bruce, refused to abandon his campaign against English control of Scotland. Bruce had already been excommunicated from the Catholic Church by Pope Clement V for murdering John Comyn, Bruce's rival heir to the Scottish throne. Bruce envisioned uniting Scotland and Ireland to create a pan-Gaelic Greater Scotia and cared very little for the demands from Rome. After having successfully raided and recaptured most of the castles in Scotland under English control, the vision was close to reality. Bruce forced England to recognise his crown by uniting Scots and invading northern England and Ireland to liberate the people of the British Isles from the ruthless King Edward II of England. The Scots and Irish razed English-controlled villages and towns until famine struck Ireland and depleted critical supplies. Struggling to survive, the army resorted to pillaging both English and Irish settlements. The devastation came to an end when Bruce's brother Edward was killed at the Battle of Fort. By that time, however, Robert the Bruce had sent a message to the world that he was King of Scotland, and Scotland was no longer under Edward's domain. On April 6, 1320, the world's first Declaration of Independence was penned at Arbroath Abbey and signed by 8 earls and 31 barons of Scotland. It was written as a response to Pope John XXII on behalf of Robert the Bruce for his excommunication and for disobeying the Pope's demand for a truce, and in no uncertain terms, declared that the independence of Scotland was the prerogative of the Scottish people, not simply the King of Scotland. The document outlined the history of the Scots and their victories over invading nations from England in the 1300s, dating back to antiquity. In that history was an unusual claim that the history of the Scots could be traced back to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, suggesting that Scotland could not be defeated because the Scots were of the royal seed of Abraham and blessed by God Himself. While the world recognizes the historical value of the document as the oldest known Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Arbroath holds significant historical value for a lesser-known group of people, converts to the British Israel movement. It is the oldest known declaration of British Israelism, the belief that the people of the British Isles are the direct descendants of the biblical Israel. The letter sent to Pope John XXII was but one of many instances where direct lineage to the children of Israel was declared, and the notion eventually developed into a sect of Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups focused on apocalypticism. British Israelites believed the lost tribes of Israel had migrated to the British Isles and were God's chosen people, protected by God and unconquerable. The movement gained a strong foothold during the 19th and 20th centuries in Great Britain and abroad, with the formation of hundreds of different British Israel organizations. In the early 1900s, the movement became more radicalized as it transitioned to Christian identity, and the underlying themes of racial discrimination began to surface. From its inception, British Israelism was a political movement aligned with the statement made in the Declaration of Arbroath. British Israelites believed that God's blessings to Israel in the Old Testament were promises made to the people of the British Isles, including promises concerning military conquest and defense. Both the biblical blessings and biblical curses were included in the ideology, including curses placed against any nation that opposed Israel. In the late 1800s, as the movement became more formalized, it adopted the lineage through Scythia, described in the Arbroath letter. British Israel historians have declared that the lost 10 tribes of Israel were transferred to Babylon about 720 BC, around the same time the Scythians appeared in the same district. They then transferred into Denmark before landing in the British Isles. King James VI of England was so devoted to the British Israel ideology that he commissioned an English translation of the Bible, known as the King James Version. English nobility at that time were trained from an early age that the lineage of English royalty could be traced to the biblical King David through Fergus I and the kings of Ireland. As the British Israel ideology began to form in England, the King James Version was widely adopted as the authoritative translation, and James' belief in the biblical promises to Israel being applied to then modern-day England was adopted through literal interpretation of the text in that translation. British Israel converts argued that England and its colonies must be the Israel to whom the promises were given, otherwise those promises were unfulfilled. British Israelism developed into an ideology outside of English nobility in the late 1700s through a mentally unstable lieutenant in the British Navy named Richard Brothers. In 1790, during what appeared to be a severe mental health incident, Brothers sent letters to the King of England, ministers of state, and the Speaker of the House of Commons, declaring himself to be called by God to fulfill the prophecy from Daniel 7 of the Old Testament. This revelation led to his proclamation that the king would die, and the crown of England given to Brothers as the nephew of the Almighty and Prince of the Hebrews, appointed to lead them to the land of Canaan. Brothers wrote 15 books on the British Israel theory while making political predictions as a self-proclaimed prophet. Some of the predictions apparently came true, attracting numerous followers to his cause. He convinced several of them into selling their property to accompany him to New Jerusalem, which he planned to build on both sides of the Jordan River in 1795. Though he was eventually committed to Bedlam as a raving lunatic, his work towards spreading the British Israel idea was somewhat successful, and others carried the torch. In the mid-1840s, the British Israel concept developed into a movement through the work of John Wilson, a self-educated son of a radical Irish weaver. Wilson lectured throughout Ireland and England on the origins of the nations of Northern Europe, which he claimed were Israelitish. A series of 5 editions of lectures were published beginning in 1840, entitled Lectures on Our Israelitish Origin. Wilson linked the British and other Teutonic peoples in his Israelite origin histories, a notion that was somewhat common in political themes of his era. Even among English scholars and German philologists, the notion of a shared Indo-European origin was growing increasingly popular. The Germans attempted to trace the languages of both nations to a common source, and the search for that source was an attempt to find the origins of the Aryan race. The British Israel movement would have fizzled out in England had it not been for the work of Edward Hine, who converted to the movement after hearing a lecture by Wilson at the age of 15. 5 years prior to Wilson's 5th edition of Lectures on Our Israelitish Origin release, Hine published his Identity of the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel with the Anglo-Celto-Saxons. The book was highly successful, selling over 250,000 copies. Like Wilson, Hine viewed himself as a spiritual authority linked to the Old Testament. While editing his Banner of Israel magazine, Hine asserted that he was the deliverer that would come out of Zion to bring the glory of the Lord to Israel. Hine was also effective in spreading the British Israel doctrine into the United States due to key differences between his theology and that of Wilson. While Wilson was satisfied that the people of the British Isles had descended from Israel, Hine declared that the tribe of Ephraim embodied the 10 lost tribes as a consolidated people, while the tribe of Manasseh lay outside of the British Isles. Hine eventually developed the idea that the tribe of Manasseh migrated to the United States and that the union between the two nations constituted all of Israel. Within this unusual doctrine, concerning the link between the United States and the tribe of Manasseh, the story of the NAR begins. The religious and political issues of the late 1800s and early 1900s were very much an open field for planting such an idea. When British Israelism was adopted by the early leaders of the Pentecostal movement and began to spread, British Israelism quickly changed the way religious leaders understood both the Bible canon and their world view. Gerald L.K. Smith, a white supremacist politician and a Disciples of Christ minister, is widely recognized for his push to spread Christian nationalism throughout the United States. After the Indiana Klan was exposed for attempting to seize control of the government in the late 1920s, Smith moved to Shreveport and made connections with key political figures, including Louisiana Governor Huey P. Long. Among other things, Smith is infamous for his Christian nationalist crusades of the late 1940s. The group was formally organized in St. Louis in 1942 to preserve America as a Christian nation, being conscious of a highly organized campaign to substitute Jewish tradition for Christian tradition, to oppose communism, world government and immigration, and to, quote, fight mongrelization and all attempts to force the intermixture of the black and white races. As it relates to the NAR, Smith is of key interest in multiple areas of influence, through various connections to key figures in the latter rain movement and ideologies presented in the form of racist and anti-Semitic doctrine. Smith launched the group's political and religious newsletter, The Cross and the Flag, in 1947, the same year that latter rain broke out in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. He also had ties to latter rain leader and early voice of healing publicist, Jack Moore, in Shreveport, through Moore's father-in-law, Reverend Grover C. Lout. Lout was engaged in special police work while working on the Shreveport Ministerial Association, of which Smith's Shreveport Christ Christian Church and his predecessor, Dr. A. Preston Gray, were affiliated. The association openly engaged in political and religious espionage. As Smith rose through the ranks of the white Christian nationalist underworld to become the imperial wizard of the California Klan, his lieutenant was Reverend Wesley A. Swift, a key figure in transitioning British Israelism into Christian identity and source of latter rain's two-seed or serpent seed doctrine. It is largely due to the work of Smith and Swift that the group earned the label White Christian Nationalists. Though Smith's organization of Christian nationalists began in the 1940s, the movement was by no means in its infancy. Smith was strongly aligned with the British Israel theory, and due to his obsession with the anti-Semitic protocols of the learned elders of Zion, he saw the formation of the nation of Israel as the first step in a long battle against what he, and many others of the British Israel Christian identity groups, claimed to be the Jewish problem. They viewed the formation of the nation of Israel as divinely inspired by God, but believed the Jewish Americans to be the so-called false Jews that were filled with satanic blood from Christian identity's two-seed theory. However, before Smith's so-called Jewish problem, there was the so-called Negro problem of Smith's political and religious forefathers. Prior to that was the so-called Indian problem of their fathers. In fact, some historians of white supremacy trace the origins of Christian nationalism all the way back to 1452, when Pope Nicholas V granted Portuguese King Alfonso V rights to root out all Muslims and pagans and anyone opposed to Christianity by whatever means possible. Quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, referring to Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Considering the NAR Seven-Mountain Mandate, known as the Seven-Mountain Dominionism theology, the Pope's charge to invade, subdue, and pillage the kingdoms of all in opposition is very troubling. NAR leaders believe there are aspects of today's society that believers should seek to invade, influence, and subdue. Family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. As an anti-Catholic movement, how did this mandate develop? How did the NAR abandon the Apostle Paul's charge to Titus and the early church for leading through good example rather than forcible conversion? As it relates to the Christian identity themes found in NAR agenda, our story goes back to the year 1877, when President Grant commissioned a bipartisan solution to political divisions. On January 29, 1877, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Electoral Commission Act, which established a 15-member commission of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats to settle the disputed 1876 election. New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden had just 1 vote shy of the 185 required electoral votes, and 20 electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina were unresolved. Both Tilden and Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes claimed victory in those states, and it was left to the Electoral Commission to decide the next president. Hayes ultimately won the presidency after the Compromise of 1877 ended in a promise that he would withdraw federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. As a result, Hayes was never seen as credible by his opponents, and he was taunted with such epithets as his fraudulency and Ruth the Fraud. Hayes did not view himself as a Christian, let alone a descendant from the lost tribes of Israel. He often stated that he was not a Christian and did not belong to any church. An entry in his personal diary summed it up: "The literature of the Bible should be studied as one studies Shakespeare." Rutherford was not in favor of mixing religion with politics, often being branded as a political enemy by one party or another for keeping the two separate while in office. Though the First Amendment to the Constitution established a separation between church and state, there were many people who viewed that separation as a political weakness, especially when legislation concerned core values established by Christian churches. For Americans in the South, federal enforcement of the rights of freedmen and freedwomen was seen as a violation of the First Amendment, and Rutherford represented an enemy of both church and state, regardless of the compromise. Rutherford's wife was a devout Methodist, and while not religious, Rutherford wrote that he enjoyed attending the Methodist Church. This was especially the case with Southerners unhappy with the outcome of the Civil War. During the war, Northern Methodists used the army to seize control of several Methodist churches in large cities. By 1871, the Northern Methodists had 88,000 black members in the South and had opened numerous schools for them. In the South, the issue of race divided the political party lines. Southern Democrats strongly opposed the Republican Party for multiple reasons, the biggest of which had to do with the color of the constituent skin. Blacks in the South made up a core element of the Republican Party. Black ministers in the South had a significant role in politics. Over 100 black ministers held offices in state legislatures during Reconstruction, and several black ministers were elected to Congress. In the North, several denominations, especially the Methodists, supported the radical Republican agenda. Radical Republicans were a faction within the Republican Party that referred to themselves as radicals due to their goal of immediate, complete, and permanent eradication of slavery in the United States. Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson of Philadelphia built his legacy as the high priest of the radical Republicans by organizing Methodists for the cause. These factions eventually led to the social gospel movement within liberal Christianity and, ultimately, the liberal fundamentalist debate. The divisions in American Christianity, combined with the general lack of trust in both elected officials and religious groups, amplified by the issue of race, created an open field for which the British Israel doctrine could easily take root. Shortly before Hayes was elected in 1876, Union Congregational Church pastor Joseph Wilde of Brooklyn did just that. Starting that year, Wilde preached a series of 130 British Israel sermons across the span of 3 years. In 1879, he began publishing pamphlets to spread the British Israel message. For Wilde, that message was one of both religious and political superiority. All across the United States and Canada, British Israel ministers, churches, and organizations followed suit. In the 1880s, Toronto clergyman W. H. Poole began spreading British Israelism in Ontario and in the United States. M. Eshelman, an author and student of Edward Hine, published his British Israel book, Two Sticks, or The Lost Tribes of Israel Discovered. Reverend Elihu P. Ingersoll, a congregational preacher from Kansas, and Reverend George O. Barnes, an evangelist from Kentucky, also published books on British Israelism. The movement's growth in the US eventually attracted Edward Hine himself. From 1884 to 1888, Hine lectured in cities throughout the United States and Canada, appearing in large cities in the East and Midwest, as well as a host of smaller communities. By the time Hine returned to England, his name had been well established in North America, and the British Israel movement had a strong foothold in the United States and Canada. Of all the leaders of British Israelism in the United States, none were as influential as Professor C.A.L. Totten, referred to by notable white supremacists in the Christian identity movement as Professor Totten of Yale. In fact, Totten was so well recognized in the United States and abroad that his work was the catalyst for Hine's tour throughout North America. Hine stayed with Totten in New Haven for several weeks and later described Totten as, quote, "a great help to me and has a good score of marvelous identifications of the Americans with Manasseh." Professor Totten intends to publish his researches for the good of America. Totten was a West Point graduate from a military family who served as a first lieutenant on the post-Civil War Army. He is credited as one of the first to bring the practice of wargaming from Germany to the United States and published his book on the subject, Strategos, in 1880. Though it was later believed to be derived from the Prussian Kriegspiel via translations held by the British military officers in the 1870s, Totten's version had the advantage of American publication and earned recognition whether plagiarized or not. So much so that in 1889, Totten was appointed as the Professor of Military Science and Tactics at Yale University. He remained there until August of 1893, at which time he resigned to focus solely upon writing apocalyptic and esoteric interpretations of the British Israel doctrine. Throughout his life, Totten would publish over 180 books and articles, including a 26-volume series entitled Our Race, dedicated to British Israelism. Totten linked the British Israel movement with Anglo-Saxonism, a secular movement that believed in the destiny of Anglo-Saxons to rule the world. Totten's works attracted countless people to British Israelism, including dozens of influential evangelists and authors. Totten fully accepted Hine's theory that the people of the United States were the descendants of the tribe of Manasseh and furthered that notion by claiming that historical artifacts in American history held symbolic meaning, confirming British Israelism. His 1897 book, The Seal of History, for example, allegedly linked the Great Seal of the United States to the tribe of Manasseh. As a British Israelite, Totten was strongly opposed to the metric system and was an active member in the International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Anglo-Saxon Weights and Measures. He claimed that as Israelites, the United States and Great Britain were destined to rule the world. As rulers, the imperial system would reign, and the metric system was a scheme that would eventually fail. His thoughts were embedded in the group's theme song, A Pint's a Pound the World Around, which Totten himself wrote in 1883. According to Totten and the song, the Anglo-Saxon race shall rule the earth from shore to shore. The unusual problem, as Totten's militant form of British Israelism suggests, lies within one single word from the song: race. In Totten's era, the United States faced the so-called Negro problem, and it is clear which race was suggested. Gerald L.K. Smith believed that this word, race, would relate to the so-called Jewish problem. However, ignoring the anti-Semitic themes about the gospel and the Jews, many churches in the NAR today present themselves as neither racist nor anti-Semitic. How would the NAR view this phrase today? How did Totten's religious beliefs of Anglo-Saxons' rule of the world transition to the NAR views on dominionism? To find out, we must first explore how Totten's views spread through the first wave of Pentecostalism. In 2011, NPR's Terry Gross broke the news about an evangelical Christian movement seeking to take dominion over politics, business, and culture. Leaders of the group believed that they were apostles and prophets, gifted by God for that role, aiming to establish their dominion over the kingdom immediately prior to the return of Jesus Christ. Listeners who had never heard of the movement were shocked to hear that the United States was being so strongly influenced by a domestic group, especially to hear that it was a Christian group behind the alleged plot. The audience was captivated as Gross interviewed a guest who had been investigating and documenting the NAR and its vast network of evangelicals, yet they were confused as to exactly how to determine whether or not all evangelicals fit into the same category. The program examined the man considered to be the architect of the NAR, C. Peter Wagner, but admitted that the movement was much larger than the network of apostles organized by Wagner himself. While not every evangelical minister claimed to be involved with the NAR, many of them could be identified by their ideology and the methods used to achieve the objectives common to the NAR. This ideology, according to the researcher, involved taking dominion over the United States through spiritual warfare. The NPR program stated, quote, "They believe that they can, through this demon warfare, take control over entire communities, or perhaps nations or people groups, an ethnic group, or a religious group." In the program, NPR noted that the NAR 7 Mountain Mandate was organized as a collaborative campaign among leaders in the network. These leaders were planning to seize control and take dominion over 7 areas, which they called mountains. Although only a few years old, the campaign was one of the most interesting and important to the NAR due to one of the mountains: business. The guest emphasized that business is considered to be one of the most important mountains to reclaim, because this is the way that they finance the other mountains. Compared to the early Christians described in the Gospels, the NAR method of developing covert, strategic, financed operations to gain dominion over society seems vastly different and out of place. When Jesus sent the 12 missionaries to proclaim the message, "The kingdom of heaven has come near," they were instructed to begin their mission penniless, with the assurance that they would find converts to provide for their needs. Jesus asked of them, "Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts." Yet the NAR claims that their methods are necessary according to kingdom theology. If there is to be a kingdom, it must be financed. How did these views change so dramatically? Why do the apostles of the NAR today begin missionary work with massive efforts to collect money? To find out, we must examine one of the most significant influences of the modern evangelical movement, A.B. Simpson, the founder of the Alliance World Fellowship. Albert Benjamin Simpson was a faith healer and the founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, or CMA, known today as the Alliance World Fellowship. Simpson popularized the concept of holy laughter, a state of spiritual euphoria causing uncontrollable laughing. He also propagated the notion of severing the body of Christ by declaring certain Christians as carnal as opposed to those who are spiritual. Though Bible scholars recognize that there is no biblical basis for the distinction between carnal and spiritual Christians, this view became very popular years later when the latter-rain movement attempted to brand non-latter-rain Christians as apostate. Key figures in and connected to the CMA and Christian identity were connected to latter rain. The distinction between the carnal and spiritual, according to Simpson, could be made based on the believer's level of dedication to the CMA cause. Simpson framed his doctrine of dedication according to the architecture of Keswickian, or higher life theology, which served as the foundation for the second blessing, or filling with the Holy Spirit to achieve entire sanctification within evangelical Christianity. According to the doctrinal teachings of the CMA, humans must fully surrender to attain perfection. Those who were unable to do so were labeled as carnal Christians. In and of itself, setting aside any doctrinal concerns one might have with Keswickian theology, these perspectives were relatively benign. However, when combined with Simpson's premillennial theology and the British Israelism ideologies of that period, they took on a more destructive nature. While Simpson's direct ties to British Israelism remain uncertain, his evangelistic philosophy showed compatibility with the Zionist tendencies of British Israelism. Similarly, Simpson, like the proponents of the British Israel movement, developed a fixation with end times timeline predictions. In 1894, long before the nation of Israel was established, Simpson declared that there would be a great crisis in the fortunes of the Jewish race in the year 1895 or 1896. Simpson predicted that the Ottoman Empire would collapse, the false prophet from Revelation would soon rise, and the church was in the time of the end. Simpson believed that Jesus Christ would visibly return to earth and establish a new kingdom, a new world order in which Christians governed non-Christians with Christ as the reigning king. According to Simpson, this new world order was soon to be established, and once the old order was replaced, the change would remain for 1,000 years. His views were largely shaped by a religious experience that he claimed to have had in Louisville, the climax of which left him filled with the Spirit. It was about this same time that Simpson became convinced of the premillennial doctrine. This experience came shortly after his 8-year pastoral position at Knox Church in Hamilton, Toronto, leaving Simpson with a vast network of connections to other influential ministries. Knox Church was one of Canada's largest and most influential congregations. One such connection was that of C.I. Scofield, author of the popular Scofield Reference Bible and outspoken leader in dispensational theology. Dispensationalism is the view that the 7 churches of Asia Minor described in the book of Revelation were not actual churches, but instead were dispensations of time. Scofield and a vast network of similarly minded Christians of the era popularized that notion, and though never fully adopted by Simpson, it appears to have influenced his views on eschatology. Like other dispensationalists, Simpson adopted the view that a rapturing of saints, or those who had achieved the higher life, would occur before the Great Tribulation of Revelation 7. Simpson's lectures on the subject were extremely popular and very profitable. Meetings frequently brought in offerings ranging from $27,000 to $100,000. That's between almost $1 million and $3.6 million in 2024. His ability to convince crowds to forfeit such large sums of money was so unusual that as early as 1896 it was suspected that Simpson used hypnotism. Whether or not that was the case, Simpson quickly developed a cult following with open pocketbooks. Participants in Simpson's meetings freely gave away cash, jewelry, money, real estate, and more. Some donors wished to recover their donations once they broke from Simpson's spell, but Simpson responded that a gift once made to the Lord could not be returned. During the revivals, Simpson stressed the urgency of the donations by claiming that the end of the world was at hand and that the second coming of Christ would be brought on by special missionary efforts. Simpson also stressed the urgency of the donations by his doomsday calculations and predictions. When those predictions failed, Simpson pushed the date of the prediction forward, keeping his cult of personality held captive by fear. It was later learned that a large portion of the funds donated were deposited in his wife's personal bank account, and that missionaries were only receiving a small percentage for their travel expenses. One newspaper article read, Reverend A.B. Simpson of New York drew from an audience of 6,000 persons a collection of $40,000 for foreign missions. The collection was made in cash, jewelry, pledges of money, and real and personal estate. Preceding the collection, the Reverend Mr. Simpson preached a stirring missionary sermon in which he declared that the end of the world is near and that the second coming of Christ can be hastened by an evangelization of the world through special missionary effort. He said too much money is wasted on beautiful church edifices. A.B. Simpson and the CMA profoundly impacted the Pentecostal movement. Simpson's fourfold gospel was dubbed the heart and spine of Pentecostalism, as well as the British Pentecostal missionary theology by Cecil Paul Hill, founder and president of the Pentecostal Missionary Union. His lectures and books on the subject eventually led to the formation of Amy Semple McPherson's Foursquare Church and her repackaging and rebranding the doctrine as her Foursquare Gospel. McPherson's massive Angelus Temple was the first true megachurch, and as we will later examine, the theological training center for key figures in Christian identity. Simpson's fourfold doctrine emphasized key biblical concepts, the most important of which was Revelation chapter 7. This chapter describes 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, a vision that, while not directly aligned with British Israelism, resonated well with its themes and would have been very popular among its converts. The first 8 verses detail the sealing of 144,000 individuals from the tribes of Israel, with a distinct number from each tribe marked on the forehead as servants of God. These marked individuals are then depicted standing before God's throne, where they proclaim, as stated in Revelation 7 verse 10, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." This proclamation formed the cornerstone of Simpson's fourfold gospel. The influence of Simpson's fourfold gospel is evident when examining core theological principles within the Pentecostal and latter rain movements. Simpson used John 17 to stress the significance of sanctification and turned to Matthew 18 to highlight the crucial role of divine healing. Notably, he referenced the end of Revelation 2 to proclaim the imminent return of Jesus Christ, a message that would have also resonated with followers of British Israelism. "I will also give that one the morning star. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches." The morning star theology, a fundamental element of British Israelism, gained prominence through the work of C. Piazzi Smythe, an esteemed astronomer and pyramidologist. Smythe, known for writing the introduction to Totten's seminal work The Order of History, played a crucial role in popularizing this theology. British Israelites in the United States hailed Totten as a prophet and often cited Smythe, whom Totten apparently esteemed as the most profound and confirmed astrologist the world has ever seen. In the evolution of British Israelism towards Christian identity, pyramidology and astronomy became core doctrine, particularly within the latter rain movement. Adherents of latter rain believed the zodiac to be humanity's original Bible and the Great Pyramid of Giza to be the second. These, combined with the King James Version of the Bible, created a spiritual trinity for the movement. How did Simpson's 4-part gospel and financial strategies mix with esoteric themes to enter the Pentecostal movement? How did these concepts lay the framework for the early leaders in the new Apostolic Reformation? To find out, we must examine a very unusual convert to Simpson's movement who radicalized and thought himself to be the last messenger to declare the coming apocalypse. In 2006, NAR leader Rick Joyner published his books, The Harvest and The Call, both of which played significant roles in promoting and disseminating the Joel's Army and Manifest Sons of God theology. The Harvest vividly described an end-time army of believers, gifted with extraordinary powers and divine authority, to establish God's kingdom on earth. According to Joyner's vision of the future, an elite group of believers would rise to a state of spiritual maturity and divine power, enabling them to perform great miracles and overturn world systems, to claim dominion over unbelievers. The Call continued the story by delving deeper into the spiritual journey of believers, emphasizing a radical commitment to the mission by heeding the call of God to join Joel's army and engage in spiritual warfare against the enemy, referring to unbelievers. That same year, Joyner posted a sermon called The Warrior Nation, the New Sound of the Church, in which he called these believers freedom fighters and claimed that the army was already forming. The strategy was very successful and extremely profitable. Joyner sold over 1 million copies of each book, and very quickly, Manifest Sons of God and Joel's Army theology spread throughout NAR churches. Within weeks, other ministers capitalized and monetized Joyner's doctrines. One NAR prophet, Todd Bentley, tattooed the words, Joel's Army, and dog tags across his sternum. Bentley was seen by many as a general in this army, and willingly donated to its cause. He even rented baseball stadiums, arenas, and airport hangars that cost as much as $15,000 a day. an expense valued at over $21,000 as of 2024. Joyner and Bentley, however, were not the pioneers in popularizing these doctrines. These themes were already significant within the latter rain movement that emerged in 1948, and the terms Joel's army and latter rain were both inspired by passages from the Old Testament book of Joel. Specifically, Joel 2 verse 23 encouraged the children of Zion to rejoice over the former rain they had received and the anticipation of the imminent latter rain. Verse 25 describes the affliction of locusts, caterpillars, and palmerworms upon them, metaphorically referred to as a great army. The latter rain revival was spearheaded by William Branham, who played a crucial role in propagating the two-seed doctrine of Christian identity. In the theology of latter rain, it was believed that the most sinless among the believers would be endowed with the manifestation of God, granting them supernatural abilities. These elite believers were eventually referred to among latter rain converts as the manifest sons of God. Though the passage from Joel is believed by many Bible scholars to symbolically refer to the invasion of the Assyrian army under Sennacherib, and most scholars agree the passage is written in prophetic symbolism for events that happened in the ancient world, the British Israel framework enabled leaders of latter rain to repurpose Joel's prophecy to apply to the 20th century. Many latter rain believers were certain that Branham had been manifested with the spirit of Elijah, though the Assemblies of God denounced the movement as heretical and made a significant impact in halting the notion. Since Branham died in 1965, leaders of the NAR who promoted the Manifest Sons of God doctrine began applying Branham's Elijah title to the movement as a whole. Branham cannot be fully credited for this heretical doctrine. Not only have many of Branham's claims of revelation been proven to have been plagiarized, but the Manifest Sons of God theology, credited to latter rain revival attendee George Warnock and his book, Feast of Tabernacles, also appears to be the result of a long history of similar doctrinal errors. To understand how this doctrine evolved within the NAR, one must first examine its development within the latter rain movement, particularly as Christian identity was spreading. However, before delving into that, it's essential to understand how the architecture for the doctrine was created through British Israelism. The Elijah concept within the doctrine played a significant role in this evolution. To gain insight into that, we need to explore how British Israelism entered the Pentecostal movement through Frank Sanford and the Holy Ghost Anna Society. Reverend Frank Sanford was a radical preacher from Maine who emphatically preached about the impending apocalypse. He was deeply influenced by the teachings of A.B. Simpson and the agenda of the CMA, adopting Simpson's vision of global evangelism to prepare the church for the second coming of Christ. Sanford attended CMA revival meetings alongside his wife Helen, whom he had met at a conference where Simpson was the keynote speaker. Helen, the daughter of a wealthy cotton broker, had abandoned her career to engage in Simpson's missionary work and had recently returned from a missionary journey to Japan. Sanford's involvement in activities associated with Simpson gradually increased his recognition. By 1890, he was leading choirs of up to 100 voices at events featuring Simpson. Simpson and the CMA faced continuous scrutiny from skeptical journalists concerned about the substantial amounts of money circulating through the revivals. This scrutiny eventually escalated into a conflict between Simpson and the news media. Simpson defended the CMA by stating that the financial records were transparent, overseen by a missionary board that included a treasurer and a financial agent. However, journalists contested this claim, pointing out that Simpson's wife, who occupied these financial roles, directly deposited offerings into her personal bank account. This practice blurred the lines between personal and organizational funds. Significant discrepancies were identified between the amounts collected for missionary work and the actual funding allocated to these missions, to the extent that the missionaries were suffering due to lack of funding. Despite the increasing skepticism, Sanford remained undeterred in advancing his mission. He viewed himself a successor to Simpson, intent on furthering the cause in more grandiose and costly ways. Sanford established a modest Bible school, selectively admitting young men and women, and initiated fundraising for what would ultimately become his Shiloh compound near Durham. The community began adopting loaded language for themselves and their mission, using names like Holy Ghost Annas Bible School, World's Evangelization Crusade, Church of the Living God, Shiloh, and the Kingdom. Sanford persuaded his followers that God was directly communicating with him for divine revelations. He claimed that they were whispered to him by God himself. Over time, these revelations became increasingly significant to the mission and, according to Sanford, were most greatly manifested in himself. He began to position himself as both a new apostle and a prophet within the group, asserting that God had chosen him to receive these revelations in private for a greater cause. Sanford claimed to be the living embodiment of the Old Testament's David, intertwining his understanding of British Israelism with messianic themes. This destructive theology took an even more sinister turn when Sanford incorporated a passage from Malachi 4, stating, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." He asserted that he was the modern-day Elijah foretold by this passage, signaling that the great and dreadful day was imminent. Prior to the climactic moments of his destructive cult of personality, Sanford was in many ways the prototype for the modern Pentecostal movement. Along with the fourfold gospel of Simpson and Simpson's Keswickian influence, Sanford's theology was formed by doctrines he learned from Dwight Moody when he attended Moody's College of Colleges at Northfield Mount Hermon School in Northfield, Massachusetts. Moody trained Sanford to mold his ministry around three core doctrines: personal holiness, living by faith, and informal preaching. It should come as no surprise that Pentecostal founder Charles Fox Parham patterned his own ministry and compound after the methods of Sanford, after having collaborated with Sanford in the year 1900. Sanford began building what was to become the largest Bible school in the world. It cost over $100,000 to construct. Two massive 40-foot carved wooden gates named the Gates of Praise opened to the inner courtyard of the compound, which was nearly a quarter-mile square. The church on the ground stood 4 stories tall, housed more than 20 rooms, and was dominated by a 7-story turret known as the Jerusalem Tower, which loomed over the entire complex. A second, shorter turret named David's Tower stood directly opposite. It was so impressive that Charles Lindbergh flew over it to catch a glimpse during his tour of the United States after his famous 1927 flight. Lindbergh thought it was the state capitol in Augusta. To Sanford's followers, it was the kingdom. To outsiders, it seemed more like a prison. Once people from the community entered to become members, they seldom returned. Leaving was difficult due to the fact that everyone had surrendered their possessions to join. By 1900, over 150 converts had joined Sanford's cult. That number grew exponentially when Sanford claimed to have raised Mrs. Olive Mills from the dead, though skepticism also increased when it was revealed that the alleged miracle was not mentioned until after Sanford's public announcement. Shiloh had become the central headquarters for the world's evangelistic movement, and word quickly spread that God was working directly with Sanford. Letters from potential converts poured in from people eager to learn more about this new sect. Those who forfeited their life savings to join Sanford claimed they were, quote, approaching the kingdom of God Almighty. However, not everything was blissful in Sanford's evangelistic utopia. Marital divisions arose among several converts who signed over their life savings and property to Sanford. Friendships and families were severed when Sanford's faith cure failed. Those who could not be cured were deemed unworthy of the Holy Ghost and a society. Those who did not obey Sanford's rules were subjected to a practice the group called putting people into hell until their minds were broken, leading some to mental insanity. Escapees claimed that nearly all of Sanford's practices were designed to break the will of the people. Food was rationed, and members of the commune, including nursing infants, were required to fast. People became so weak from hunger that they could not walk. Medicine was strictly forbidden within the community. Some people who should have been under proper medical care died. Children who disobeyed were flogged, and public examinations of children were often conducted. Yet with all of the negative publicity, Shiloh remained impressive enough to attract Pentecostal founder Charles Fox Parham. Two of Sanford's evangelists met with Parham in Topeka and invited Parham to the compound. Parham spent a month at Shiloh, where he most certainly came in contact with British Israelism. Sanford taught the works of Cal Totten in Shiloh and openly praised Totten for his work. Sanford claimed that Totten was to Bible study what Galileo was to astronomy. Shortly after meeting with Parham, Sanford made his first public declaration outside the compound in November 1901, proclaiming himself as the manifestation of Elijah. Announcing his intention to expand his movement globally, he purchased the flagship of the New York Yacht Club, the Coronet, which was regarded as the era's finest vessel, with a construction cost of another $100,000. Accompanied by several followers on the Coronet and more on its companion ship, Kingdom, Sanford embarked on a 3-year, round-the-world tour of disaster. When the Kingdom capsized, its crew members were forced to join the others on the Coronet, which did not have enough room or supplies to meet their needs. In 1911, on a cold October night off the coast of Portland, Maine, the crippled yacht limped into port. As it docked, men quickly scrambled to aid the vessel. To their surprise, they discovered 50 men, women, and children in critical condition, suffering from sickness and starvation. Death had already visited the vessel. Scurvy was beginning to claim the lives of the malnourished. Deckhands, once strong and capable, were reduced to skin and bones. The crew and passengers were so exhausted and weak that they could barely stand. Had the ship not reached port that night, it is doubtful they could have kept the craft afloat for even a day longer. The rescuers were shocked to find mere skeletons manning the pumps, alternating in 3 shifts. Their astonishment grew when a single passenger emerged, well-nourished and well cared for. While everyone else struggled to survive, Frank Sanford had lived in luxury in his plush, furnished cabin. In the end, Sanford was convicted of manslaughter due to the deaths of members of his crew aboard the Coronet and was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in an Atlanta prison. However, Sanford's influence did not cease there. Not only did his cult persist, eagerly welcoming him back after his sentence, but figures like Parham also adopted significant aspects of Sanford's financial, religious, and doctrinal strategies, including the Elijah claims. The Pentecostal movement that emerged drew not only from Sanford's legacy, but also from those of similar ministries, particularly one in Illinois, whose impact would resonate for decades, and that was far more destructive. The belief in modern apostles and prophets as spiritual authorities within the church, held by the NAR, comes with serious consequences. In many cases, these individuals are granted authoritarian control. As leaders of a group convinced they are engaged in spiritual warfare within a vivid realm of angels and demons, these authoritarian figures assume the role of generals in an army. The rank-and-file members, serving merely as privates, are enlisted in a battle they do not fully comprehend. The concept is widely promoted in the series titled God's Generals, which, to the NAR, has become akin to the books of Kings from the Old Testament. In these works, author Robert Liardon chronicles the lineage of pivotal figures in the NAR's formation, dubbing some of the most influential among them as, quote, generals. This viewpoint suggests that, historically, the Holy Spirit has opted to guide Christians through individual leaders rather than directly through the believers' hearts, in opposition to New Testament teachings such as Romans 5 verse 5. Many of the men and women chosen as key figures were hardly worthy of their titles, and some were outright evil. Arguably, a few could be described as generals for the forces of Satan rather than of God. Some of the worst built their religious and financial empires on the backs of others just as evil. Yet, some truly viewed themselves as generals in God's army, engaged in spiritual, and sometimes physical, battles against the enemy. Among them, Pentecostal General Charles Fox Parham was involved in various scandals, including magic gold elixirs, quests for the Ark of the Covenant, and accusations from numerous parents of sexual crimes against their children. He confessed to at least one of them. Foursquare General Amy Semple McPherson staged a fake kidnapping to cover up sexual affairs and was implicated in real estate scams near a fake megachurch. Pentecostal General John G. Lake has been labeled a con-man for a variety of false claims and scams, the most egregious involving an arrest for fraudulent stock sales to his own congregation. Charismatic General Catherine Kuhlman rented hundreds of wheelchairs for her faith-healing crusades so that able-bodied attendees could rise from them as part of a deceptive, staged act. Like Frank Sanford, latter-reign General William Branham, leader of the post-World War II healing revival, convinced his followers he was the manifestation of Elijah the prophet through numerous failed or inaccurate predictions and fraudulent healing claims. Living in the age of information, when critical aspects of their lives and ministries are now widely known, huge questions are raised. Why do leaders of the NAR give such reverence to con artists, criminals, and child predators? To find out, we must examine the most famous of the Elijah con artists, God's General, John Alexander Dowie. Scottish-American faith healer John Alexander Dowie is often considered the prototype for the modern apostles and prophets of the NAR. He not only created a financial empire but also attempted to establish a theocracy, gaining himself a somewhat successful control over politics. Known for his boisterous claims of direct communication with God and the ability to heal the sick, Dowie is regarded by many as the first modern apostle. After being involved in numerous scandals in Australia, including the controversial takeover of a church from a critically ill pastor and misusing the church funds, Dowie migrated to the United States, seeking new opportunities for his divine healing scheme. Starting in San Francisco and eventually moving to Los Angeles, Dowie convinced people of his healing powers by sharing letters of testimony, allegedly from those he had cured in other cities. Initially, his strategy was highly successful, earning him significant media attention with headlines such as Modern Miracles. Some meetings featured individuals who testified about their improvements after receiving Dowie's faith cure, and reporters covered these events without any critical analysis or investigative effort. Reporters in Oakland were not so easily impressed by the letters and few witnesses, and they reserved their praise until they witnessed an actual healing. People seeking a miraculous cure continued to come, arriving hopeful but leaving with their afflictions unchanged. One particularly sad case involved a boy deformed by a spinal disease who approached Dowie for the faith cure. Both reporters and the audience eagerly watched for a miracle, but none occurred. A reporter from the Oakland Tribune waited for an hour and 20 minutes to see any sign of improvement. But, as with the boy with the spinal disease, each person who received their alleged healing remained unchanged. The conflict between Dowie and the newspapers set the stage for many future confrontations in both his ministry and those who modeled their apostle strategies after him. Whenever a critical article about Dowie was published, he labeled the reporters, and often the newspapers themselves, as enemies of Christ, persuading his followers that they could not be trusted. As reporting evolved from questioning his credibility to exposing his fraudulent claims, Dowie's followers were quickly conditioned to abandon critical thinking and accept his statements at face value. In the end, the newspapers on the West Coast gained the upper hand by launching an awareness campaign to educate residents about Dowie's methods. Before long, even many of his faithful followers began to notice that all of Dowie's alleged healings were never local and always occurred in another county. Some regular attendees were driven to the brink of insanity and others sought legal counsel for damages. One woman in particular was offended by Dowie's insulting labels such as Jezebel or harlot and sued him for slander. The West Coast was no longer a fertile ground for harvesting victims for his scam, and Dowie was forced to relocate to the Midwest. The timing of Dowie's move was fortuitous, and his choice of location strategic. He established his base in Chicago just as the city was preparing for the World's Columbian Exposition, also known as Chicago's World's Fair. By the time the fair opened in 1893, Dowie had rented a property adjacent to the fair's entrance with a rickety wooden building later to be called the Little Wooden Hut. The name was fitting, as the structure was essentially a small wooden building, albeit with a facade resembling a full-sized church to give the appearance of an established place of worship. As visitors passed by his makeshift church, Dowie stood out front, ready to draw them in to experience his faith cure during services held at 10:30 a.m., 2:30 and 7:30 p.m. Dowie's makeshift church stood directly opposite Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, just outside the entrance of the fair. Fortunately for Dowie, because Buffalo Bill's niece, Sadie Cody, who claimed to have been healed by Dowie's faith cure, played a significant role in launching his new denomination, the Christian Catholic Church. After her story was published in the Chicago Tribune, thousands of visitors flocked to Dowie, eager for a glimpse of a miracle. The sudden surge in fame gave Dowie the opportunity to expand his operations. The Christian Catholic Church grew to include 5 locations and established makeshift healing homes for those seeking cures to reside in until they were healed. Letters from across the United States flooded in, with those containing substantial sums of money receiving priority for a response and an invitation. One witness later testified that Dowie ignored any letter that did not include money. Furthermore, those chosen to reside in the healing homes were carefully vetted by Dowie's staff and selected based on their personal wealth. Dreams of being healed were quickly dashed upon entering Dowie's healing homes. Patients found themselves alongside individuals with contagious and deadly diseases and those suffering from severe mental health issues, with no proper procedures in place to ensure their safety. Those who escaped or were expelled from the homes reported that Dowie had violently coerced them into submission. Others, whom Dowie declared cured, were helplessly cast out onto the streets, still suffering. All the while, Dowie demanded more money to provide for them. One neighbor described the horrors. Quote, "I have seen the streets of the neighborhood filled with cripples, in the dead of winter, who had been driven from their invalid chairs, stripped of their crutches and turned forth cured, or undergoing the process of being cured. They have slipped about on the ice, and have fallen upon the street to be picked up by sympathetic neighbors, while Dowie strode among them with a head aloft blind to their suffering and cries for help." Those expelled from the healing homes lost more than just a chance at Dowie's faith cure. In the Christian Catholic Church, salvation was directly linked to healing. Dowie introduced a doctrine asserting that patients he could not heal were doomed, proclaiming, if Christians expect to reach heaven, they must first be cured of all diseases that flesh is heir to. This doctrine was later carried forward into the latter rain movement and beyond by a high-ranking member of Dowie's sect, founding member of the Assemblies of God, and member of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, Fred Francis Bosworth. Leaders of the healing revivals such as William Branham called it the gospel of divine healing. However, it was certainly not good news, or gospel, for those who had given Dowie their life savings in exchange for a chance at a bed in the healing homes, only to be turned away as hopeless cases, especially for those who contracted contagious diseases from neighboring beds. This posed a significant problem for city officials, who recognized that Dowie was a rank imposter, effectively operating hospitals without any medical experience, equipment, or medicine. Dowie's faith cure doctrine prohibited medical science or treatment, which resulted in almost countless civil and criminal cases against him in Chicago, ranging from theft and misuse of funds to health code violations over the frequent deaths. Some of the deaths were preventable with proper medical care. It was later learned that others, such as John G. Lake, were involved in fraudulent strategies to lure unsuspecting people into Dowie's healing homes. Lake and his family were instrumental in convincing audiences of Dowie's faith cure, and some of the alleged cures were simply outlandish. In one instance, Lake claimed that his sister had 5 cancers and that he himself reached into her chest and pulled out black tumors. Some scams involved Lake's family standing by to send a telegram of their alleged healing, while Dowie claimed that he was remotely administering a faith cure. According to the written records of the events, Lake, his brother, 2 of his sisters, 3 sons, and his wife were all rescued from near death multiple times over the course of just 8 years. It should come as no surprise that Lake's healing revival meetings frequently featured distant healings, unstage extraction of tumors, and more. Dowie's rise to fame came at the height of popularity of British Israelism in the United States. The same year Buffalo Bill's niece helped launch Dowie's ministry, Cal Totten resigned from his position at Yale to devote his full time to the spreading of British Israelism through books and lectures on biblical chronology, biblical prophecy, the Great Pyramid, British Israelism, and other esoteric subjects, all of which Dowie leveraged to make his Christian Catholic Church more appealing. It was highly successful. In just 10 years' time, Dowie had amassed $15 million. That's over $500 million in 2024. Like his contemporary, Frank Sanford, Dowie envisioned his church seizing control of Jerusalem for their cause and incorporated British Israel symbolism into his sect. His church buildings were named Zion, after the hill on which Jerusalem sits and which is interchangeably used to refer to the city itself. After facing an overwhelming amount of legal challenges in Chicago, Dowie founded the city of Zion, located north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. Lots in the new city were leased for as much as $150,000. That is $5.5 million in 2024. Worse, the lease term was for 1,000 years. Dowie convinced his followers that was due to the 1,000-year reign of Christ, according to Revelation 20. Dowie believed that at the end of his life, quote, the millennium will have set in and he would be back in 1,000 years. Dowie's claim that he was the manifestation of Elijah the prophet from the Old Testament was widely known, as were his many ethical, civil, and criminal violations. In his time, Dowie became the most notorious religious con artist covered by newspapers worldwide. The problems he introduced into 20th century Christianity have been the subject of countless books and theological studies. Besides the God's General series and a few individuals who modeled their religious strategies after Dowie's empire, very few Christians aware of Dowie's behavior would regard it as part of a Christian movement. How did John Alexander Dowie's claim to be Elijah the Restorer and the first apostle influence the development of apostolic faith, and how did this evolve into the prophets and apostles of the NAR? How did his views on the millennium and Christ's rule from Zion shape the NAR's restoration and dominionism doctrines? To understand these transitions, we must first examine the genesis of modern Pentecostalism, the history that many Pentecostal historians have attempted to erase. Modern apostolic networks, one of the most powerful aspects of the NAR, are viewed by many critics of the movement as particularly troubling. Networks of ministries led by apostles and prophets, who claim to receive extra-biblical revelations from God for new doctrines, began to intersect. Each intersection point spawned a new NAR network to further develop and add to those doctrines. By January 1997, groups focused on the concept of spiritual warfare had grown so large that they were reorganized as the United States Spiritual Warfare Prayer Network, or USSPN. Within just 5 years, the USSPN had organized 14 task forces and appointed coordinators for each of the 50 states in the US. This network emerged in the wake of a troubling symposium led by C. Peter Wagner on the campus of Fuller Theological Seminary. Wagner invited 500 delegates to discuss the future of the church in the context of a movement proposing the elimination of denominations, which Wagner referred to as a new paradigm for the church model. He proposed innovative approaches to redefine the relationships among local churches, their financial structures, communication methods, evangelism, training, prayer, and access to supernatural powers. Wagner envisioned the creation of a new movement, which he dubbed the New Apostolic Movement. Wagner's network intersected with an unusual movement led by Ted Haggard, the future president of the National Association of Evangelicals, or NAE, which Wagner endorsed as part of his vision. Haggard organized a large public prayer campaign against the so-called Queen of Heaven, whom he claimed was one of the chief demonic entities engaged in spiritual warfare against the saints. Initially, Haggard's movement targeted this figure, but it eventually transitioned into an anti-Catholic group as leaders recognized the lack of scriptural basis for their claims about this demonic entity. Over time, this focus shifted towards spiritual warfare against Mary, the Virgin Mother of Christ, with claims that Catholics had elevated Mary's spirit to a predominant demonic force. Wagner's prayer warriors fueled even more spiritual fantasy, giving rise to additional NAR networks. Ana Mendez, one of Wagner's prominent warriors, conjured up a fantasy about a so-called major stronghold of darkness located on Mount Everest in the Himalayas. With Wagner's approval, NAR leader Tony Chavez organized a team of 26 special mission warriors for an assault on the Queen of Heaven in a militarist-style operation codenamed Operation Ice Castle. The group ascended 20,000 feet to confront the invisible demons and returned victorious, paving way for the sale of books that celebrated their bravery. How did the NAR stray so far from traditional Christianity that it used fictional enemies to unite converts in fantastical battles? Where did Wagner get the idea to expand the movement through networking? Why did converts to the movement suspend critical thinking to believe in these fantasies? To understand these developments, we must begin by examining the origins of modern Pentecostalism and the early iterations of the Apostolic Network. Not long after newspapers around the world reported that John Alexander Dowie had amassed an unbelievable $15 million in just 10 years, equivalent to over $500 million in 2024, Dowie suffered a stroke. This event opened the door for opportunists to seize control of his assets. His communal city of Zion was soon overrun by new prophets and apostles who claimed to be his spiritual successors. Although they were not part of his cult of personality, they still claimed affiliation with the same spiritual network. Among those looking to pick up Dowie's Elijah mantle and claim his throne was Charles Fox Parham, the Pentecostal founder and self-proclaimed projector of the apostolic faith. Parham held a series of revivals in Zion where he claimed to have received spiritual insight, confirming that he had assumed the mantle and was now endowed with the spirit of Elijah from the Old Testament. Several of Dowie's converts began to believe Parham's claim, and a new sect of Parhamites was established in Zion. Two key Pentecostal figures were converts to Parham's new sect. The first was Fred Francis Bosworth, short-term leading member of the Parhamites and a ranking member of Dowie's cult. Bosworth was a future influencer of several networks in both Pentecostalism and latter rain. The other was John G. Lake, future founder of the Apostolic Faith Mission's network of Pentecostals. Parham, Bosworth, Lake, and other Parhamite leaders began to introduce a new brand of fantasy to Zion, far beyond the fictional world of faith cures Dowie had created. The group began to proclaim that the end of days was near, and began performing exorcisms, along with a range of ecstatic and sexual behaviors. The Parhamite fantasy escalated to such an extent that the group began inflicting severe harm on some of their own converts. Under the guise of exorcising demons from the bodies of the sick and afflicted, they physically assaulted members. In one of the most egregious cases, Letitia Greenholg, who was crippled, suffered multiple broken bones during an attempt to straighten the supposed demon from her crooked, frail body. Her agony from the injuries was so intense that she could not endure the pain and ultimately died during the exorcism. The Parhamite sect would have ended with the murder trials that followed, had Charles Fox Parham not been incarcerated for sexual assault against a young man and allegations of several cases of child molestation in Texas. The sect would have also met its end with Parham's sexual crimes, had he not escaped charges due to a technicality. Parham's defense was that he was, quote, a helpless degenerate, and the sexual crime happened during his sleep. One of Parham's students, William Joseph Seymour, was conducting a series of ongoing revivals at Azusa Street in Los Angeles. Seymour had arrived in LA after years of networking with various holiness groups, during which he made several connections. One of these connections was Lucy Farrow, who invited Seymour to preach in Los Angeles. Before joining the Parhamites as an assistant minister for Parham, Lucy was the pastor of a small holiness sect in Houston. She had previously invited Seymour to preach in her absence to the Parhamites. Just 4 days into the Azusa Street revival, the San Andreas Fault violently settled, and the city of San Francisco was set ablaze, sparking an almost uncontrollable spiritual fervor fueled by fears that the world was nearing its end. This geological event also stirred spiritual unrest among various occult groups, and the two Parhamites suddenly found themselves preaching to an array of spiritualists, mediums, and numerous occult societies attending the revival. Before long, the Azusa Street revival became a melting pot of occult seances and trances, oddly intertwined with similar seances and trances that proclaimed itself to be Christian. Taught that these experiences were evidence of the Holy Ghost, Seymour was deeply confused. He sent a letter to Parham seeking advice on how to distinguish between occult and Christian ecstasy. Parham traveled to Los Angeles, but his views, influenced by Cal Totten's Christian identity ideologies, learned from Frank Sanford and combined with his own racist beliefs, led him to disdain the racial integration at the revivals. In his autobiography, Parham declared, quote, "I have seen meetings where everyone crowded together around the altar, lying atop one another like hogs, blacks and whites mingling. This should be enough to bring a blush of shame to devils, let alone angels, and yet all this was attributed to the Holy Spirit." Ultimately, Parham was excluded from leading the revival and became just one of many figures in the emerging network of Pentecostal movements. John G. Lake, F. F. Bosworth, and Parhamite leader Tom Hesmelhalch, the same group of men whom Zion leader Wilbur Vollever accused of being responsible for the murders in Zion, connected with Seymour's network of Pentecostals to establish a critical intersection among the Zionites, Parhamites, and Azusa Street Pentecostals before launching the Apostolic Faith missions to South Africa. Hesmelhalch, instrumental in establishing that connection, also played a key role in forming several other connections due to his leadership in Zion City. In the events leading up to the death of Dowie, the Zionites splintered into numerous factions with no organized leadership. The Pentecostal network offered the perfect solution. Leadership through the apostolic network rather than any specific leader, allowing leaders of each splinter group to maintain power while receiving support from the broader network. While Lake and Hesmelhalch evaded prosecution for the Parhamite murders through a series of actions that some scholars today consider proven fraudulent cons in South Africa, Bosworth went into hiding in the Deep South as part of the early healing revivals that predated the latter reign. Armed with a photograph of John Lake, Tom Hesmelhalch, and himself seated with William Joseph Seymour, Bosworth was able to claim instant leadership within the Pentecostal networks, being one of the men to receive a direct blessing from Seymour. Early Pentecostals viewed those directly connected to Seymour and the Azusa Street revival as fountains, from which they could draw a more potent Pentecostal blessing. As it relates to the dissemination of Charles Fox Parham's views on Christian identity, Bosworth played a similar role in the United States as Lake and Hesmelhalch did in South Africa. While Lake's network, organized under the umbrella of the Apostolic Faith missions, intersected with various splinter groups from Dowie's Christian Catholic Church in Africa, Bosworth's healing revivals networked with various holiness groups under Seymour's influence in the U.S. The network splintered even further when Bosworth and his converts caused divisions after they disagreed with a newly developed Pentecostal notion concerning the initial evidence of the Holy Spirit. This eventually led to the formation of the Assemblies of God, to organizing yet another network for the two opposing views. This strategy of growing, splintering, and networking continued from the birth of modern Pentecostalism well into the latter rain movement and beyond. In fact, it appears that leaders of the various movements recognized the power of such divisions. Each new splinter group that branched from the main trunk of Pentecostalism came with its own set of new leaders and ideas, attracting a new variety of converts. Individually, each splinter group posed a threat to the overall movement. But when networked, the groups became generators of new members under the same umbrella. By 1948, during the height of the Latter Rain revival and the movement it initiated, leaders of the Pentecostal movement had refined their strategy. William Branham launched a newsletter, The Voice of Healing, to organize the various networks as an interdenominational faith, a precursor to Wagner's post-denominational faith. Gordon Lindsay, a keynote speaker at Christian identity conferences organized under the Anglo-Saxon Federation, took control of Branham's newsletter and perfected the strategy. Lindsay further expanded the group of networks by combining various British Israel and Christian identity networks with Latter Rain, Christian fundamentalist, evangelical networks, and more. As a result, a mix of both beneficial and detrimental ideologies led to the creation of a new type of Christian convert, who were often radicalized. Leaders within the Latter Rain movement branded members of mainstream Christianity who did not participate in the revivals with derogatory terms such as cold formal Christians and apostates. Many extremist doctrines, emerging from heretical teachings or pseudo-religious political agendas, were readily accepted as new revelations and propagated throughout the revivals as core doctrines. The group ensured the acceptance of all doctrines by creating an extremist interpretation of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 through 12 from the New Testament, which they called the fivefold ministry. By reversing the biblical strategy of the early church, where Christian leadership humbled themselves as servants of God to foster new leaders, the radicalized fivefold ministry established an authoritarian structure. Fivefold leaders positioned themselves as authorities on scripture and doctrine, regardless of their actual understanding. All that was required was a supernatural claim, leading the movement to conjure fantasies of angelic visitations, audible voices from God, angels, or demons, out-of-body experiences, communication with the dead, and more. How did leaders of the NAR learn this strategy of using extreme theologies to create divisions, grow splinter groups through networking, and further the NAR agenda via the NAR network? How does the NAR control such a complex network? When one splinter group develops into a threat to the network, how are leaders of the splinter groups restrained? To find out, we must examine one of the most extensive divisions in the Apostolic network that happened when certain Latter Rain leaders began promoting some very extreme Christian identity doctrines. In 2021, California surfing school owner Matthew Taylor Coleman confessed to murdering his 2 children. Coleman confessed to authorities that he was convinced that his children, aged 2 years old and 10 months old, would grow up into horrific monsters. Coleman believed that his wife had passed serpent DNA to them at childbirth. His wife had contacted Santa Barbara police that her husband had ran off with the children, but it was too late. Sadly, Coleman had taken them into Mexico and used a spear fishing gun to stop this alleged serpent DNA from producing reptilians. Though viewed as science fiction by the news media, Coleman was but one member of a larger group of people in the United States who shared his belief in the serpent DNA theory. Just a few months prior, in December 2020, Anthony Quinn Warner detonated a recreational vehicle parked on 2nd Avenue North in downtown Nashville. The blast radius was massive. It damaged 41 buildings when his RV exploded on Christmas Day. Prior to the detonation, Warner had made statements about a conspiracy that lizard people would soon take over the planet. After it was learned that the January 6th Capitol rioters were linked to the notorious anonymous group known as Q, researchers began to investigate the group and publish some of the conspiracy theories, fueling the plots carried out by its members. What they found was disturbing. The serpent DNA theory was just one of the conspiracy theories, and the rioters and terror groups were only a small part of the Q network. Researchers identified another, much larger and very disturbing group of people: Qvangelicals. A growing number of evangelical Christians were adopting QAnon theories as part of their own plot to eradicate unbelievers from the United States government and establish a theocracy. Some researchers noticed many similarities between the doctrines of these evangelicals and the Christian identity doctrines described by Michael Barkun in his book, Religion and the Racist Right: The Origins of the Christian Identity Movement. How did the serpent DNA theory find its way into evangelical Christianity? When did Christian ministers begin to adopt conspiracy theories as part of their Sunday sermons? To find out, we must examine one peculiar conspiracy theory that was used to transition British Israelism into Christian identity, and how it found its way into the latter rain movement, which would lay the foundation for the NAR. When the British Israel doctrine was infused with the racially charged politics of the late 1800s in the United States, the racial aspects of the doctrine were amplified. Leaders in the movement began to follow the doctrine to its logical conclusion. If the white-skinned people of the British Isles and the United States were the descendants of the biblical Israel, people with non-white skin were not. Passages from the Old Testament that described God's blessings to Israel were already included in the British Israel doctrine. What about the other passages from the Old Testament that described foreign nations? If Israel was to be blessed while other nations were cursed, what was their ancestry? One of the earliest attempts to solve this puzzle within British Israelism is found in the writings of Russell Kelso Carter. Carter was a graduate of the Pennsylvania Military Academy. He held a degree in civil engineering and taught science and chemistry at the academy until 1872. After resigning, Carter was ordained a Methodist minister and eventually became a Church of God Holiness minister, prolific author, and songwriter. He penned the words and music for 52 hymns, including the 1885 hymn, Standing on the Promises. Carter also authored books on Christian holiness, faith healing, and British Israelism. His doctrines on faith healing influenced E.W. Kenyon, leading to the development of the Word of Faith theology. He also collaborated with A.B. Simpson and the Christian and Missionary Alliance, preaching at many of the CMA conventions until the group rejected Pentecostalism and Carter separated from them. In 1894, Carter published his book, The Tree of Knowledge, which played a key role in the development of the two-seed doctrine in British Israelism. According to Carter, quote, "The tremendous pull of the sexual appetite, aroused by the excited state of the woman, caused the downfall of the human race in the Garden of Eden." The result, according to Carter, was Cain, who Carter believed to be the literal son of the biblical serpent. Carter asserted that the British Israelites were descendants of the so-called righteous seed through Adam, while all non-British Israelites were descended from the so-called serpent seed through the serpent's sexual affair with Eve. Carter believed the serpent of Eden was Satan, who sought to destroy God's pure race, quote, "at its fountainhead." The title of Carter's book refers to a passage from the 2nd chapter in the book of Genesis that reads, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." In the biblical narrative, the serpent from the Garden of Eden beguiled Eve to eat of the fruit, meaning charmed or enchanted to deceive her, leading to the downfall of the human race. This account in Genesis is referred to as the original sin. In the Tree of Knowledge, Carter diverged from many other Christian scholars who believed that the biblical serpent was possessed by Satan. Carter believed that, quote, "Satan cohabited with Eve, teaching her how to secure pleasure when the natural time had not fully come." In other words, Carter believed that the original sin was sex. This assertion introduced the idea that the original sin was rooted in racial impurity, leading his readers to conclude that the political turmoil was the result of an impure race. Most Christians interpreted the Genesis account of Eve disobeying God by eating fruit, literally. For mainstream Christianity, introducing sex between Eve and the serpent into the narrative also introduced implications of sexual innuendo, considered heretical. Though its integration into British Israelism was a new concept, the idea of a sexual union between Eve and the serpent did not originate with Carter. In fact, it was declared to be a heresy by the first Christian apologist, Irenaeus, in the 2nd century. In his book, Against Heresies, Irenaeus linked this belief to those of the Gnostics. The notion of sex generating both a good force and an evil force within ancient mythologies was fairly common. However, according to Irenaeus, the introduction of pagan myths into Christianity was deemed heretical. This heresy had made its way into American Christianity in the 19th century through the doctrine of Daniel Parker. Parker was a Baptist preacher who believed in predestination, the divine foreordaining of all that will happen. He became very militant in his position on predestination when he introduced the two-seed doctrine into his theology and declared that some people simply could not be saved due to their lineage. In 1826, Parker published Views of the Two Seeds, a pamphlet describing the ancient heresy. Those of the so-called good seed, or the elect, could be saved, while those of the so-called bad seed, the non-elect, could not. According to Parker's theology, any attempt to share the gospel with the non-elect would be fruitless. Parker spread this belief among the primitive Baptists, or two-seed in the spirit predestinarian Baptists, which numbered almost 13,000 in 1890. Parker's pamphlet predated the spreading of British Israelism in the United States by over half a century. As a result, when British Israelism adopted the two-seed doctrine, it was already compatible within many Christian groups that believed in predestination. When the two-seed doctrine merged with British Israelism and the more militant Anglo-Saxonism doctrines, it formed a very deadly combination, both politically and religiously, and sometimes physically. While British Israelism was primarily focused on the blessings for God's chosen people, the two-seed doctrine brought attention to God's enemies. Adding Anglo-Saxonism to the mix empowered British Israel leaders to develop doctrines claiming that the elect were destined to rule over the non-elect. Had it been introduced initially within the British Israel framework, this would have been purely anti-Semitic. However, in the racially charged political battlefield of the late 1800s and early 1900s in the United States, it evolved into a blend of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Worse, as the doctrine transitioned to align with white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, all groups targeted by the Klan, such as Catholics, were seen as part of the anti-elect agenda. By the 1930s, the most extreme versions of British Israelism saw this agenda as a war against the elect. Enemies of white supremacy groups were deemed soldiers enlisted by Satan himself. As Michael Barkun notes, this is the most distinctive doctrine of the Christian identity movement and the premise for the group's demonization of the Jews in the later years. Barkun also noted that this doctrine originated from individuals lacking a solid understanding of theology or Christian history. While Irenaeus noted the existence of this doctrine in the early Christian centuries, there is no evidence that the British Israel movement directly used those sources. Regardless, the eventual interpretation of the doctrine within the British Israel movement closely resembled ancient Gnostic versions. According to both interpretations, Satan impregnated Eve with the purest form of evil to produce Cain. In both interpretations, the Jews emerged from Cain's bloodline. The Christian identity movement took this a step further when it associated Cain's so-called evil seed with the non-white races. This premise became the cornerstone of the Christian identity movement, with its leaders identifying with the elect seed and positioning it as true Christianity, while labeling other non-white supremacy branches of the Christian faith as evil villains. The doctrine continued to develop well into the 1960s during the height of the Latter Rain movement. George Houghton, one of the founding members of the Sharon Orphanage from which the Latter Rain movement originated after the Latter Rain revival, was prolific in spreading all elements of British Israelism, Anglo-Saxonism, and the two-seed doctrines. According to Houghton, quote, "Blacks were created in God's wisdom to serve whites." It was not until 1989 that Houghton retracted his statements, and only after complaints were filed with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. William Branham, leader of the Latter Rain and voice of healing revivals, officially introduced the doctrine in his 1958 sermon, The Serpent Seed, as, quote, "a recent revelation," but unofficially taught the doctrine throughout his recorded ministry. He was first introduced to the doctrine in the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God sect, led by white supremacy leader Roy Davis. Davis was formerly the second-in-command of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan under William Joseph Simmons and the official spokesperson for the group in 1923. Branham taught the two-seed doctrine throughout his recorded ministry, though somewhat covertly, until the Christian identity movement went public with the doctrine in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Why were religious leaders of that era compelled to consider William Branham to be the leader of the post-World War II healing revivals, knowing his views on Christian identity and the serpent's DNA? How did that belief impact the end-time revival doctrines of the NAR? To find out, we must dig even deeper into the Azusa Street revival. Among the doctrinal themes found in the many churches within NAR networks, none are as widespread as the notion of an end-time revival just before the second coming of Christ. NAR apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers build anticipation for this coming revival and stress the urgency of this predicted event. Various key words are used in sermons and lectures to focus the listener's attention on this prediction, such as gathering of the saints or end-time harvest. Conventions are advertised with revival themes, while books and literature promote the idea that one of the smaller revivals might result in the worldwide revival that is predicted. While the idea of a worldwide revival as a prerequisite to the return of Jesus Christ is an extra-biblical concept that helps to identify a group within the NAR, the idea itself is nothing new. Worldwide revivals were also a theme used among converts to the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and many of the key figures involved with the CMA organized splinter groups with the same theme. Some of these key figures, such as Frank Sanford and F.F. Bosworth, played significant roles in shaping and influencing the Pentecostal movement. Others involved with the CMA, who never joined the Pentecostal movement, such as Paul Rader, were instrumental in shaping the fundamentalist and evangelical movements. Their influence contributed to a large group of Christians outside of the Pentecostal movement that could easily adopt worldwide revival themes as part of their belief system. Though very similar and built upon the same idea, the NAR version of the end-time revival doctrine is both more complex and disturbing. Leaders of the NAR combine other core doctrines with the revival concept, ranging from spiritual warfare to dominionism, to create a militant form of revival that could also be viewed much like a series of end-time battles, strategically claiming victory over the end-time war, which will allegedly result in the return of Christ to the earth. Training its members to be spiritual warriors, while also promoting the belief that Christians outside of the NAR network are weak or apostate, the NAR version of the end-time revival theology quickly turns into an ultimatum given to outsiders. An outsider will be forced to choose between the end-time revivalists or Satan himself. How did the NAR make the connection between Christian revivals and the apocalypse? Where did leaders of the NAR get the idea to use a revival as a means to separate the sheep from the goats? To find out, we must first examine events that took place during the Azusa Street revival, which the NAR claims to be one of the key milestones in history leading to the worldwide revival. When Charles Fox Parham came into contact with the British Israel doctrine at Frank Sanford's Holy Ghost Annas Bible School, he also encountered the notion of a worldwide revival. Though he did not participate in Sanford's mission to forcibly convert people by sailing his vessels to their shores and attempting to engage in spiritual warfare, while preaching offshore and praying towards foreign soil, Parham adopted the idea that global evangelism was vital to hastening Christ's return. Parham was not the only key figure in Pentecostalism to be influenced by Frank Sanford's unusual doctrines. Pentecostal leader and first general overseer of the Church of God, A.J. Tomlinson, was also among Sanford's converts. Tomlinson was baptized into Sanford's movement in 1897 by Sanford convert Ralph Gleason and was rebaptized by Sanford himself in October 1901. It should come as no surprise that Tomlinson played a key role in promoting the belief in a coming worldwide revival within Pentecostalism. As it relates to the NAR version of the worldwide revival, Sanford's version of the doctrine included a critical component: urgency. Sanford was a doomsday prophet who used fears of impending doom to instill a sense of urgency. He was most famous for his failed 1909 doomsday prophecy, having declared that the world would end at exactly 30 seconds after 10:20 a.m. on Wednesday, September 15, 1909. Converts to both the NAR and Sanford's version of the doctrine are led to believe that not only is a global revival necessary for the second coming of Christ, but also that it is urgent, and that Christians must quickly hasten this revival through rigorous prayer and spiritual activities. Without this sense of urgency, it is unlikely that the Azusa Street revival would have been viewed as the epicenter of modern Pentecostalism. The very unusual events that happened leading up to and during the Azusa Street revival might have otherwise caused a healthy level of skepticism towards the event. NAR historians sympathetic to Pentecostalism consider the Azusa Street revival to be a holy event inspired by God, wherein an outpouring of the Holy Spirit occurred for several months. These historians present a largely one-sided view of the event, basing their assessment upon the accounts given by Pentecostals who were either present at the revival or in close contact with someone who was. As such, those accounts are also sympathetic to the event, omitting any of the details that do not support their narrative. According to those historians, the gift of speaking in tongues transferred to believers was the main attraction. Though that version of the story is partially true, and what the newspapers called a quote, weird babble of tongues, there was a mixture of converts and so-called unbelievers, curious to see the commotion. Contrary to the picture painted by NAR historians, new conversions to the Pentecostal faith were not the objective. The curious people who attended were denounced as so-called unbelievers, and William Seymour heaped anathemas upon their souls, less than 2 weeks into the revival. When the Los Angeles Times published an article on April 18, 1906, and the public was suddenly made aware of the most unusual scene taking place, the tensions were dramatically amplified. What began as a small revival, meant only for those sympathetic to Seymour's interpretation of Parham's and Sanford's theology, quickly became a religious circus, where the potential Parhamites were the main attraction. It was estimated that among participants in the revival, only 1 in 10 people were converts to the religion. The rest were there for the thrills, with free admission. Glossolalia was the main attraction of the revival, but not for the reasons one might conclude from later accounts of the event. Preaching from the Bible was negligible for multiple reasons. Before the pandemonium ensued, Seymour had come to teach Parham's theory concerning speaking in tongues. When news began to spread, and the so-called unbelievers began to examine the process, it was discovered that Seymour read from the Bible in intervals of only 1 or 2 words between episodes of religious frenzy. Others, who were illiterate, claimed to be given the power by God to read the Bible, but were unable to display this new power. This was far from the only unusual attraction bringing in large numbers of people. NAR historians have failed to mention the holy kick that accompanied the glossolalia. This omission is likely due to the fact that city officials were called to the scene when the holy kickers turned dangerous. Only a few weeks into the revival, during the religious frenzy, revivalists became so worked up that moments of insanity plagued the movement. Some participants began to bark like dogs, while others stomped on the floor. Several women began lying on the floor and kicking their heels in the air, leaving parts of their bodies exposed during the services, so much so that newspapers noted the exhibitionists exposed more than the strip clubs were allowed. Like the strip clubs, some of the kickers ran outside to bring back male companions, throwing their arms around their necks. Witnesses described one man narrowly escaping the insanity. Some of the women openly confessed having left their husband and children in order to enjoy more power. Men and women openly embraced in ways unbecoming of a Christian of the era, which apparently caused several curious young girls to enter the revival unattended. Between the reading of 1 or 2 words from the Bible, the kicking and stomping, and the unintelligible words, prophets began to utter words from the Lord in the form of failed prophecies, and the predictions given in English were recorded. Some men stood claiming to prophesy, but uttered words that were not in any known language and therefore useless to the group. It was predicted that railroads would bend and would no longer be usable. It was also predicted that steel girders would fall, causing large buildings in Los Angeles to crumble. One prophecy declared that automobiles would suddenly stop after their power disappeared. Complete destruction of large cities, such as Chicago, Los Angeles, and Pasadena, was declared. Police were frequently called to the revival, and not simply for the revivalists disturbing the peace. Some of the new converts used indecent language at police officers before being arrested and booked for insanity. One man was stabbed in an arranged duel outside the Azusa Street mission. The man refused to give any details concerning his opponent or the reason for the duel, other than to state that it was an affair of honor, and that he was stabbed by one of several men in front of the church. Considering the fact that several of the women in the mission left their husbands, significant questions are raised about the duel. It became clear from the police reports that conversions to Christ were not part of the Azusa Street revival's agenda. Not only were the unbelievers at the meeting cursed by the leaders of the revival, but some were physically assaulted. Such was the case of 62-year-old E.P. Harlan. Apparently, towards the end of the revival, the ministers in the Azusa Street Church openly declared that they did not allow sinners participating. Harlan rose to confess his sins, asking for instruction, and several men of the congregation grabbed him and ejected him from the building. The old man was badly bruised and taken to a hospital. It was also clear from the police reports that the spirit channeled by the revivalists was not one of peace. When police were called to halt the noisy revivalists at all hours of the night, the revivalists seldom complied and were sometimes arrested for disturbing the peace. Rather than apologize to the police or the neighbors trying to sleep, converts cursed the police force. Some even went so far as to pray to God that eternal fire would plague the heads of police, while proceeding to cause similar disturbances in the jail. Police surgeons were called to examine those arrested and found at least one to be suffering from emotional insanity and feared that she may commit some act of violence at any time, believing that she was destroying sin. Regardless of its unusual and dubious history, the Azusa Street revival changed the course of Christianity in ways that could never have been predicted by any of the prophets who spoke at that revival. Azusa Street set the precedent for future revivals in modern Pentecostalism and the groups that Pentecostals influenced, leading to new revivals and new religious movements originating from those revivals. Though the early leaders of modern Pentecostalism believed it to be a revival that would ignite a worldwide revival, before the sudden destruction of major cities in the United States, leading to the end of days, the first wave of Pentecostalism faded away, and converts believed each new revival to be the new catalyst for the end-time revival. As it relates to the spread of Christian identity in the United States, the Azusa Street revival and the resulting modern Pentecostal movement were critical components. Thanks to the influence of Parham and others, many Pentecostals adopted the British Israel theology and aided in the transition from British Israelism to Christian identity. Due to the Azusa Street revival, Los Angeles became a major hub of Pentecostalism, and Parham held sermons and lectures on British Israel themes. It is also believed that Parham was using his Pentecostal influence to spread the works of Christian identity leader Gerald Burton Winrod, as Parham praised the Klan in the 1920s and was a contributor to Winrod's newsletter. How were Parham and others able to spread Christian identity throughout churches in the United States and abroad using Pentecostalism as the means of transmission? Why did so many people, including Christians outside of the Pentecostal movement, adopt the themes of Christian identity when they came into contact with them? How did these themes make their way into the NAR? To find out, we must examine the NAR from the perspective of its classification as a social movement and its relationship to the social gospel. The networking strategy established by key figures in NAR history has been the most powerful attribute of the movement in terms of its growth and internal strength. As leaders of the charismatic movement joined the network and neo-charismatic Christianity emerged, the NAR came to represent the largest number of independent charismatics in the United States. The subnetwork of each autonomous charismatic ministry enabled churches within the movement to support each other. Although independent, these churches could work together as a family within the network. While members of the NAR see this strategy as a strength, Christians outside of the NAR find it concerning due to the perceived abandonment of sound theology and the spread of false doctrine. NAR apostles, prophets, and teachers, many of whom have limited understanding of theology, introduce extra-biblical themes into their node within the network. With the support of other nodes, these themes quickly spread. Critics of the NAR who are familiar with the histories of these independent charismatic ministries are even more alarmed because some nodes within the network are built upon a destructive combination of religion and politics from past generations, including themes such as the serpent's bloodline and more. Rather than focusing on Christian tradition and established theology, the group directs its attention toward creating an end-time revival to claim dominion not only over non-Christians, but also over various Christian denominations. Preferring pop culture and democratic individualism within the network, the NAR has developed a social network that continually re-evaluates what they consider the church to have done wrong in the past, aiming to correct it to bring forth a global revival. According to NAR leaders, this can be accomplished by further expanding the NAR network. Much like the notion of the serpent's DNA doctrine, wherein a corrupt bloodline is spreading throughout humanity, the NAR is essentially rewriting the DNA of Christianity. Researchers see the NAR network as nothing more than a social network, where popular themes determine the advancement of the movement. Sometimes the very core doctrines of Christianity are devalued. How did the NAR network develop into a social movement? How do leaders of the NAR govern such a network? When did popular themes replace the gospel as a means to grow these networks? To find out, we must examine the history of the social gospel and its relationship to Reformed Reconstructionism. The term social gospel was first used by Charles Oliver Brown after he read political economist Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty. The book, published in 1879, was widely popular, selling several million copies in the United States and abroad, and sparking the worldwide social reform movement known as Georgism, and eventually the Progressive Era. According to George, poverty persisted despite advancements in technology, education, and public services due to the increased value of resources needed for those advancements. This theory led to a ripple effect in the economy, resulting in widespread unemployment, foreclosures, and bankruptcy. The solution, according to George, was to adopt a concept he referred to as single tax. The timing of the book's publication coincided with the popularity of the British Israel movement in the United States, and many of George's themes of social and government reform found their way into the movement. Christian identity leader Howard Rand of the Anglo-Saxon Federation tied the economic slump during the Great Depression to so-called ancient pyramid prophecy, claiming that the event was foretold by imperfections in the tunnel leading to the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza. In his 1942 book, Digest of Divine Law, Rand tied George's proposal for a single tax to what he considered to be the perfect system of taxation of the Lord, claiming that George was a visionary that understood the evils of the present economy and issued an indictment of the failure on the part of modern civilization. Brown coined the term social gospel as a means to eradicate this alleged evil by using a combination of church and politics as a weapon. He had been ordained as a minister of the Congregational Church just 3 years prior to the publication of Progress and Poverty, and was just 3 votes shy of being elected United States Senator for Iowa. Congregational Church clergyman Washington Gladden, also considered a founding father and pioneer of the social gospel movement, had created fertile soil for Brown and the movement's growth through his work in applying Christian principles to social environments. His book, The Christian Way, Whither It Leads and How to Go On, was published just 2 years prior to Progress and Poverty. However, in relation to the NAR, none in the social gospel movement had as much impact as Baptist theologian Walter Rauschenbusch, pastor of the Second German Baptist Church in Hell's Kitchen, New York City. In 1892, Rauschenbusch and several other leaders in the social gospel movement organized the Brotherhood of the Kingdom that would pave the way for NAR dominion theology and to further the agendas of the social gospel. His 1907 book, Christianity and the Social Crisis, influenced several key figures in the social gospel. After the birth of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan, which established itself as a social movement that was effective in shaping certain doctrines and political themes within American Christianity, Rauschenbusch established the theological framework for the social gospel. In his 1917 book, A Theology for the Social Gospel, Rauschenbusch branded the individualistic gospel of contemporary denominations as ineffective. He stressed the importance of establishing the kingdom of God by overthrowing what he considered to be institutionalized sinfulness. He claimed that the established church systems had not evoked faith in the will and power of God to redeem the permanent institutions of human society from their inherited guilt of oppression and extortion. In Rauschenbusch's view, the kingdom of God would be established through prophetic, future-focused ideology and revolutionary social and political force. See Peter Wagner, father of the NAR and recognized for coining the term New Apostolic Reformation, not only referenced Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, but also built upon the concepts defined by Rauschenbusch and other leaders of the movement. In a memo written to NAR prophet Cindy Jacobs, Wagner described Rauschenbusch's attempt to merge the cultural mandate of the social gospel with evangelical Christianity, but claimed that he failed due to liberal theology. For Wagner, the social gospel was a powerful ideology that could be perfected by properly governing the social network through authoritarian apostles and prophets. Over time, through the work of Wagner and others, key concepts of the social gospel were adopted as core theology within the evangelical community. Shortly after the NAR was widely exposed to the public in August 2011 as a militant band of spiritual warriors on NPR by Terry Gross, Wagner joined the Fresh Air broadcast to defend his participation as the leader of the movement. Likely referring to the social gospel, Wagner admitted that the NAR was not his invention, but rather his discovery. He described himself as the first person to notice the growing movement and began writing several books on the subject while serving as the president of Global Harvest Ministries. However, Wagner's success appears not to have been due to his claim of steering away from liberal theology. Wagner's recreation of the social gospel for the NAR involved much more than a social network of elite Christians engaged in spiritual warfare. He introduced the concept of the enemy, Satan and his demonic forces, creating a parallel social network for the NAR to engage in battle. Converts to the NAR were not faced with the question of whether the social gospel should be adopted, but rather whether the enemy social network could be defeated. On Fresh Air, Wagner described one of Satan's social networks that was created in Japan. He claimed that an ancient emperor of Japan had sex with the sun goddess, resulting in a dark social network being established in the atmosphere over Japan. The so-called sun goddess was part of the network of the opposing kingdom of Satan, which Wagner claimed was permitted by God to be established over Japan. When asked about the tsunami and nuclear meltdown in Japan, Wagner explained that God could have prevented that tsunami and the destruction, but he didn't. He just took his hand off and allowed these natural forces to work. According to Wagner, this same system had been established by demonic forces within the United States through certain political figures. Wagner declared that those politicians should be considered by Christians as demonized. Worse, Wagner claimed that the same network of demonic forces could be found in other areas of society, including Christian churches. When asked how to identify those alleged demonized individuals, Wagner claimed that rank-and-file members of the NAR seldom had the ability to determine which social network controlled the person. Instead, skilled deliverance ministers were required to determine whether or not a NAR convert should engage in spiritual battle against them. Wagner made it clear that members of the NAR must adopt an insiders versus outsiders mentality when encountering non-members. According to Wagner, if a person is, quote, not part of the kingdom of heaven, it means they're part of the kingdom of darkness. Wagner admitted that the NAR views against non-members have led to violence due to their radicalization. When confronted about Christian extremists verbally or physically assaulting individuals they believe to be part of the alleged network of the sun goddess and other unseen demons governing those outside the NAR, Wagner apologized and stressed the importance of submitting to the authority of an NAR apostle. He introduced this concept as a significant change from traditional churches. When concerns were raised over the notion of a group of elite NAR apostles, determining and influencing political decisions while introducing changes in society to claim dominion over business, government, media, arts and entertainment, education, family and religion, Wagner was evasive. He claimed that NAR apostles should not use the term dominion to describe the establishment of social networks within each of the so-called mountains of the NAR 7-mountain mandate. Speaking from both sides of his mouth, Wagner claimed that the objective was not to become rulers, but instead to help bring the blessings of heaven into those mountains by establishing a strongly networked presence within them. While this may sound non-invasive to the casual listener unaware of the social gospel history, Wagner's use of the social gospel concept within the NAR social network suggests the objective to overthrow by popular vote. In other words, dominion could be achieved by assimilation. Where did Wagner get the idea that Satan and his demons were forming a social network to invade American business, government, media, arts and entertainment, education, family, and religion? Why were ministers recruited into the NAR so accepting of the fantasy world Wagner created? How were traditional Christians convinced to abandon their core Christian values to engage in spiritual warfare against invisible sun goddesses? To find out, we must examine one of Christian identity's core doctrines, Mystery Babylon. When the leaders of the NAR introduced the 7-mountain mandate theology, many of the doctrines associated with that theology linked the so-called mountains to Revelation, chapter 17, verse 9 and 10 from the New Testament. When the leaders of the NAR introduced the 7-mountain mandate theology, many of the doctrines associated with that theology linked the so-called mountains to Revelation 17, verse 9 and 10 from the New Testament. Leading up to the verses in question, the symbolic text described a harlot having had sex with the kings of the earth, and she rode a beast with 7 heads. In the King James translation of the prophecy, the vision was interpreted such that the 7 heads were symbolically described as 7 mountains. According to Revelation 17, verse 5, the name of this great harlot was a mystery. Upon her forehead was written the words, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. In C. Peter Wagner's interpretation of this passage, the heads of the beast were part of the so-called global network of Satan's kingdom on earth, and ancient kings of various kingdoms had slept with the great harlot or other harlots of the same network. When preaching the 7-mountain mandate doctrine, leaders of the NAR also include Genesis 1 verse 28 as a so-called mandate. After having created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Genesis describes God instructing the mother and father of humanity to have sex and multiply the human species. In verse 28, God instructs the 2 humans to replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Because the word dominion is used, NAR leaders claim that elite Christians should subdue other humans in the so-called mountains from the passage in Revelation, claiming dominion over them. Critics of the NAR are quick to point out that in the passage from Genesis, the instruction was to subdue the animal kingdom rather than other humans. The so-called mountains of society could not be considered fowl of the air or fish of the sea. According to theologians not sympathetic to the NAR agenda, claiming dominion over a group of humans would be a misinterpretation of Scripture. However, leaders of the NAR reject the skepticism due to one specific phrase within the passage of Genesis 1, which instructs humans to subdue every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Considering the NAR's doctrine surrounding the serpent's DNA, which developed from within Christian identity as the dual seed or serpent seed doctrines, a door is opened that enables the NAR to consider outsiders as another type of living thing that should be subdued and governed by NAR apostles. Where did leaders of the NAR get the idea that the 7 symbolic mountains of Revelation 17 were networks of an enemy invasion on society? How did they come to believe that other humans, including Christians, should be considered other living things? To find out, we must understand how the Christian identity doctrine developed into a theology that was given the code name Mystery Babylon among certain Christian extremists. When C. Peter Wagner wrote to NAR prophet Cindy Jacobs and described the failure of the social gospel due to liberal theology, he described an unusual turn of events in the movement's history. To understand the NAR's connection to Christian identity, it is critical to understand what Wagner meant by that statement. As the social gospel movement progressed and was adopted by Christian leaders who valued social change in the political landscape, strong divisions surfaced along party lines. Political leaders influenced by the social gospel, such as Harold Lloyd Hopkins, a presidential advisor for President Franklin D. Roosevelt, came under fire from Christian identity leaders due to his connection to Roosevelt. Christian identity leaders such as Gerald Burton Winrod were very outspoken against Roosevelt and believed the president to be part of the so-called Jewish conspiracy outlined in the anti-Semitic protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which Winrod helped publish and distribute. Winrod's organization, the Defenders of the Christian Faith, was instrumental in spreading both Christian identity and Christian fundamentalism in the United States. Key figures leading to the NAR had close ties to Winrod, including Charles E. Fuller, founder of the Fuller Theological Seminary where Wagner served as the professor of church growth. Winrod's organization was so strongly opposed to President Roosevelt that it began spreading propaganda about the links between the president and the so-called Jewish conspiracy, leading to a rapid decline in morale among troops during World War II. This eventually led to Winrod being named in the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. Winrod was popular among Pentecostal and fundamentalist groups aligned with British Israelism and Christian identity, as well as leaders of later movements such as Latter Rain. Even after being named Jayhawk Nazi for his socialist views and anti-Semitism, Amy Semple McPherson named Winrod as her replacement during times when she was unable to fulfill her duties as pastor of the Angelus Temple. Most notably, Winrod was asked to speak at Angelus Temple the Sunday just days after Kristallnacht, otherwise known as the Night of the Broken Glass, when the American Bund and other pro-Nazi groups praised the arrest of 30,000 Jews and the destruction of hundreds of Jewish homes, businesses, and temples. Winrod strongly influenced other Christian identity leaders such as Wesley A. Swift, a Klan leader and minister trained at the Angelus School. Swift was instrumental not only in spreading the dual seed doctrine, but also in promoting the Christian identity version of the Mystery Babylon doctrine. Swift's version, which included the so-called Jewish conspiracy and the idea of a silent invasion of government and other social networks, is remarkably similar to the version later introduced by C. Peter Wagner. Swift's version of the Mystery Babylon doctrine included a silent invasion of the United States and other countries by the Kingdom of God and the Kingdom of the World Order, which Swift and Wagner believed to be the army of darkness, controlled by Satan and his demons. Much like Wagner would do, Swift claimed that Babylon represented the citadel of Lucifer, and Mystery Babylon included the processes under which the enemies of God's kingdom work, or as Wagner later described it, networks that have been established wherein humans are being manipulated by ancient spirits of evil. Also, like Wagner, Swift claimed that an army of spiritual warriors was being raised up in a great and mighty administration through the numbers of his children he is multiplying in the midst of the earth. Especially among the Christian identity leaders who were ranking members of the clan, Wesley Swift and others linked the Mystery Babylon anti-Semitic propaganda to similar propaganda against the Roman Catholic Church, painting a picture of a joint invasion by the so-called false Jews described in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion and Catholics. Another frequently used text was the 1850s book The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. In Hislop's pseudo-history, Noah's son Shem killed Babylonian ruler Nimrod. After his death, Nimrod became a deity in the Babylonian pantheon, and a mystery cult formed around the worship of Nimrod. Hislop claimed that after being forced underground, the cult emerged as the Catholic Church, referencing the same chapter of the Book of Revelation used for the NAR Seven Mountain Mandate doctrine. He claimed the result was a vast network of satanic worship. Both Swift's anti-Semitic views of a mystery Babylonian invasion of the United States and the anti-Catholic themes found in the Two Babylons were widespread throughout the post-World War II healing revival spearheaded by William Branham. William Branham, mentored in theology by the second highest-ranking member of the Klan and other white supremacy groups, Reverend Roy E. Davis, used Swift's views to further his own agenda. Not only did Branham repackage Swift's dual seed doctrine for his own serpent seed doctrine, but he also promoted Hislop's Two Babylons as legitimate history. During the climax of the Little Rock 9 event in civil rights history, as Davis and Swift were in Little Rock organizing the protests by white supremacists and rallying for new members of their Klan organizations, Branham released his serpent seed theology, copied from Swift's dual seed theology, claiming it was a brand new divine revelation. In his sermon with that title, Branham incorporated the Mystery Babylon theology and included Hislop's idea that Nimrod was the founder of the Catholic Church. Though he likely first learned the Mystery Babylon theology from either Davis or Swift, Branham convinced converts to the latter rain movement that God had revealed these ideas to him in the form of a vision or other supernatural experience. The themes of demonic conspiracy that Wagner, Swift, and Branham have in common regarding the Mystery Babylon doctrine are also found among other unorthodox religious leaders predating them. The notion of a secret demonic religion can be traced back to 1869 by Gougenot des Museaux, who almost a century before the development of Christian identity suggested that an esoteric cult from the ancient spirits of evil was passed down among the Jews to emerge as the representatives on earth of the spirit of darkness. Mormonism founder Joseph Smith declared in his book, Pearl of Great Price, that Cain entered a covenant with Satan, a secret combination, and their works were in the dark. Like Swift and Branham, Smith claimed that this secret cult survived the Great Flood through the lineage of Ham, a critical part of the Mystery Babylon theology. Though Smith differed from Branham and Swift concerning the dual seed doctrine, the concept was very much the same. Even without the serpent's DNA, Smith created the concept of two bloodlines of humans, one good and one bad, engaged in spiritual warfare throughout time. Smith did link the bad guys to what Christian identity would call the curse of black skin, but did so through the notion of a secret society of evil humans being manipulated by demonic forces within Satan's network. In his book Pearl of Great Price, Smith argues that the biblical Cain was the first person to form a secret society, an organization founded anciently by Satan, with Cain, periodically renewed in ancient times by satanic revelation, internally protected by covenants of the blackest sorcery, and established for the express purpose of murder and plunder. The secret society version of the Mystery Babylon theology, as it exists in both the NAR and Christian identity, has been the core doctrine used by many extremist groups and domestic terrorists for decades. Wesley Swift went on to organize the virulently anti-Semitic Christian Defense League in 1962, where Aryan Nations founder Richard Butler served as national director. Butler became ordained as a Christian identity leader through a theological correspondence course, and the Aryan Nations adopted the Mystery Babylon theology. By 1977, Butler had decided to form the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, named after Swift's church and officially named the political arm of the church Aryan Nations. The group has been linked to numerous violent crimes and killings, and nearly disbanded when they were indicted by a grand jury in Fort Smith on sedition charges as godfathers of a conspiracy hatched at the 1983 Aryan World Congress. While one might mistakenly assume that the leaders of the new Apostolic Reformation do not advocate violence or terrorism when presenting doctrines in common with these extremist groups, the many historical links suggest a pattern of destructive theology that breeds extremism. For example, researchers have found links between the NAR and the riots at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. On January 5, NAR Apostle Cheon, one of C. Peter Wagner's most dedicated students and most successful heirs, spoke to the crowds who would perpetrate the Capitol riot. At the same time, due to the weaponization of religion for political influence, many members of the NAR have been convinced that the insurrection was nothing more than a propaganda device by those in Satan's network, in the so-called mountain of government and the news media. This idea appears to come directly from NAR apostles and prophets, whose failed predictions over the outcome of the 2020 presidential election left them exposed as frauds. Why did the NAR decide to adopt doctrines that are commonly found among domestic terrorist organizations? How are NAR apostles and prophets linked to these political agendas? Where did the Mystery Babylon doctrine of Christian identity enter the historical lineage of the NAR? To find out, we must examine another doctrine common between the NAR and Christian identity: the manifest sons of God.
We hope you've enjoyed the first part of Christian Identity from Weaponized Religion to the NAR. The transcript for the series was produced from the book, which will be released on Amazon September 1st. You'll find a link to the book in the video's description. Part 1, which includes the introduction and the first 10 chapters of the book, focuses on the early foundations laid that would eventually develop into the new Apostolic Reformation. As many of you have noticed, it's a nasty combination of the worst ideas and doctrines from several movements in history, from modern Pentecostalism to Christian nationalism and Christian extremism. Also, as many of you noticed, in the Mystery Babylon episode, the book will tie that history to some very troubling current events. The worst of these movements have embedded themselves deeply into evangelical Christianity to influence and control the agendas of the Republican Party. As a registered Republican myself, I can say that some of those agendas have good intentions, but the bad actors involved and the militarized way in which they're being pushed is very troubling. The book explains why this is and why the bad actors have chose the Republican Party as their platform. There was an event in history when white supremacy shifted quickly from the Democratic Party to the Republican because they wanted to remove a sitting president from office. The histories of those bad actors today can be traced directly to that event. Personally, I'm not a fan of either party today, and if it could be traced to the Democratic Party, the book and the series of videos would be exactly the same. This was the first time that we attempted to produce research videos in a graphic novel style, and when we created the concept, we had no idea how popular that it would become. The series quickly became one of the channel's most watched collections of videos. The concept for this video came to me on a trip home from a weekend getaway with the family. I had been wrestling with the struggle between trying to find the time for the massive amount of research and writing involved in this book, and on the production of the many podcasts, research articles, news media requests, and other things that we do at William Branham Historical Research. There simply was not enough time for the book and the research, and writing was my passion. So I began experimenting with the various AI platforms, which at the time were very crude. It was like talking to a 2-year-old with the vocabulary of a college grad, having the memories of an elderly man, all who escaped an insane asylum. Some of the first images took as many as 6 hours for a single image to create, and the characters in the scene appeared to become angry at me when I continued to tell them, "No, that's not right, change it." I probably would have given up if not for a major update in the AI platforms. It wasn't so much that it was better, but it was faster. As an artist, I was able to alter the scenes that AI generated to fit the story. I wasn't at all a fan of the AI voices. They sounded like robots, and not like good ones. Rosie the robot from the Jetsons sounded better. But with all of the many AI tools that I used, I found it much easier to focus on the writing while I offloaded the time-consuming work to AI. There were tasks that were better suited for each of them, from Microsoft to Google, and eventually even Facebook, which felt more like a toy than a tool. By the end of part 1, much better voices were released, and some of them sounded so real that it was difficult for me to distinguish between them and a human. But since I'd already begun with the British voice, which was by far the best of the originals, I continued using it. In the end, it worked out well. We received more compliments on the series than anything else that we have produced since the Message docuseries on William Branham and Latter Rain. The book, now completed, contains hundreds of references and quotes to help other researchers as they try to understand the new Apostolic Reformation. You can get it on Amazon September 1st.